You click this video to finally understand Odin, the Allfather, the god who ruled the 9 realms with knowledge, manipulation, and paranoia. Tonight, I'm going to tell you Odin's complete story in God of War, who he was before he became obsessed with Ragnarök, what he did to prevent his prophesied death, and why his need to control everything ultimately destroyed him and everyone around him. If you enjoy this, please consider liking and subscribing. It tells me you'd like more deep dives like this. Odin wasn't always the ruler of a broken world, but his path was paved in blood from the very beginning. The lore suggests he is the grandson of Buri and the son of Bor, born into a time when the realms were still raw and unformed. He wasn't alone in those early days, as he stood alongside his brothers, Vili and Vi, watching a world that felt too small for their ambition. They made a choice that would define every age that followed, murdering the first giant, Ymir, to seize control of the 9 realms. This wasn't a sudden act of survival, but a calculated coup that established the Aesir as supreme rulers through sheer violence. Some believe that the death of Ymir was the first time the realms truly knew fear, as the blood of a creator was used to build the throne of a king. From the exact moment of Ymir's death, something changed inside Odin that he couldn't ever reverse. He witnessed a reality tear, a glimpse into something that sat beyond the physical world and the gods themselves. Just this sight sparked an infinite, obsessive hunger to understand the deep meaning of life and death. It wasn't enough to rule the lands. He had to know why they existed and what would happen when they stopped. He became a man haunted by a vision he couldn't explain, and that mystery turned his curious mind into a dark cage. He started to look at his brothers and his people as tools to help him solve this cosmic problem. The god of transition was gone, replaced by a man who saw the universe as a secret he was entitled to steal. Imagine a mind that's constantly reaching for a truth it can't quite touch. Odin spent centuries looking into the spaces between the realms, searching for the source of that first tear. He grew distant from the simple joys of a young god, trading the warmth of the sun for the cold light of forbidden knowledge. He didn't want to just exist. He wanted to be the one who wrote the rules of existence. His brothers slowly faded into the background of his story, unable to keep up with a man who was already living in a future he hadn't built yet. This was the birth of the Allfather persona, a mask designed to hide the fact that he was terrified of his own ignorance. He built a world around himself so he'd never have to feel small again. The lore suggests that his obsession was like a slow poison that seeped into everything he touched. He began to categorize the realms, not to appreciate their beauty, but to map their weaknesses. Every mountain, every river, and every soul became a data point in a grand equation he was desperate to finish. He wasn't interested in a kingdom that grew naturally. He wanted a kingdom that followed his precise blueprint. He saw the giants as obstacles, because they had a connection to the world that he lacked. He hated their silence and their foresight, because it reminded him that there were things he couldn't control. He was a king who was already preparing for a war against fate, even before fate had a name. But here's the thing about a man who wants to know everything. He can't ever trust anyone else. Odin's brothers likely saw the shift in him, the way his eyes would go flat when they spoke of peace or family. He was moving toward a version of himself that would eventually sacrifice anything for a glimpse of the truth. He wasn't a monster yet, but the foundation was laid with every secret he kept and every lie he told to keep his power secure. He convinced himself that his violence was a necessity for the order of the realms. He believed that the death of Ymir was the first step in a long journey towards safety, but it was really the first step toward the end. He was a god built on a murder, trying to find a holy answer in a pile of bones. As the centuries passed, the memory of who he was before the tear began to fade. He became a master of the mask, showing his people the king they wanted to see while he worked in the dark. He wasn't interested in the love of his subjects, only their obedience and their information. He started to build Asgard as a fortress for his mind, a place where he could hide from the chaos he'd helped create. The first Aesir was gone, and the Raven God was taking shape, ready to watch the world burn if it meant he could finally understand the fire. He was a man who had traded his heart for a library, and he was just getting started on the first chapter of a very dark history. Allfather Odin didn't just take a title. He claimed a legacy that tied the entire world to his blood. He called himself the Allfather because he is the literal ancestor of most Aesir gods and many human lineages. This wasn't about being a loving parent, but about being a primary source of power and authority. He built the realm of Asgard, not as a home for his people, but as a dedicated research complex for his own ends. Every street and every hall was designed to funnel energy and information back to him. He established the Great Lodge specifically to house his military and scientific operations, turning his family into a department of his state. He wasn't a king sitting on a throne. He was a manager running a system. His most effective tool for control was the seizure of the Valkyries and the creation of Valhalla. He didn't build these things to protect the souls of the dead or to honor the brave. He built them to create a personal army of Einherjar that would follow his every command without question. He wanted a force that was already dead, because a dead man doesn't have a future to lose. This army was his primary wall against the prophecy of Ragnarök, a wall built from the ghosts of heroes who thought they were serving a god. He looked at the 9 realms and saw a battlefield, and he spent every waking moment making sure he had the most soldiers on the field. He was a man who turned the afterlife into a warehouse for his war machine. Now here's where it gets complicated. Odin's title was a trap for everyone around him. By calling himself the father of all, he made his desires the desires of the world. If a son disagreed with him, it wasn't just a family argument. It was a betrayal of the order of the realms. He used this weight to keep the Aesir in a constant state of performance, making them compete for a scrap of his approval. He wasn't interested in their growth, only their usefulness to his research. He turned his own sons into extensions of his will, weapons that he could point at any problem that slowed his search for the mask. He was a man who had replaced love with a checklist, and he never missed a mark. The Great Lodge was the heart of this suffocating atmosphere. Imagine living in a place where the air itself feels like an interrogation. And Odin was always listening, always watching through his network of spies and ravens. He didn't want his people to be happy. He wanted them to be busy. He convinced them that the world would fall apart without his guidance, that the chaos of the other realms would swallow them whole if they didn't follow his rules. He was a master of the psychological game, making the Aesir feel like they were the chosen few while he treated them like disposable parts. He was the Allfather of a house of cards, and he was the only one who knew how thin the paper was. The lore suggests that Odin's relationship with the Valkyries was particularly cruel. He took their natural purpose of choosing the slain and twisted it into a recruitment drive for his private guard. He didn't care about the balance of the realms or the natural flow of souls. He only cared about the count. Every soul that went to Valhalla was a soul that didn't go to Helheim, and every soul in his hall was a potential shield against a giant's hammer. He was hoarding life the same way he hoarded secrets, hoping that if he had enough of it, he could bribe the end of the world. He was a man who had turned the sacred act of death into a bureaucratic transaction. Ultimately, being the Allfather meant being the only one who was allowed to have a vision. Everyone else was just a character in his play, meant to speak their lines and then disappear when the scene was over. He didn't see the Aesir as gods with their own destinies, but as reflections of his own brilliance. He built Asgard to be a monument to his control, a place where the messy reality of life was replaced by the clean lines of his design. He was a father who had decided that the only way to save his children was to keep them in a cage of his own making. He sat in his lodge, watching his army grow, and waited for the day he'd have to use them to kill a prophecy. The moment Odin's hunger for knowledge became a madness was when he chose to hang himself from Yggdrasil. He spent 9 days suspended between the realms, his body failing while his mind reached for the roots of the world tree. He didn't do this for the benefit of his people or to bring light to the realms. He did it to plunder the tree's deepest secrets. He was willing to die just to see what the tree knew about the end of all things. The lore suggests that he returned from that branch with a mind that was permanently fractured. He had seen things that a god wasn't meant to see, and he could no longer find peace in the world of the living. He was a man who had looked into the abyss and decided he wanted to move in. His desperation didn't stop with the tree, as he eventually sought out the well of knowledge, known as Mimes Brunner. He was so consumed by the need for foresight that he sacrificed his own eye to the water, believing it was a fair price for the ability to see the future. But here's the problem. He wasn't as smart as he thought he was. Mimir, the man who guarded the well, had tricked him with hallucinogenic mushrooms. The visions Odin saw weren't pure truth, but a distorted reflection of his own fears and desires. When he realized he'd been fooled, the shame of it curdled into a deep, lasting distrust of everyone around him. He didn't learn wisdom. He learned how to be paranoid. This trickery fueled his need to control every single variable of the future through stolen prophecy. He stopped trusting people and started trusting only what he could take by force. He viewed the world as a game of chess, where he was the only player allowed to see the other side of the board. He began to hunt for every seer and every mural that might contain a scrap of the future he'd missed. He wasn't interested in the advice of his council or the feelings of his family. He only cared about the next piece of information that would prove he was right. He was a god who had traded his sight for a vision that was nothing but a lie. Imagine the atmosphere in Asgard after the well. The Allfather was always staring with that one remaining eye, searching for a betrayal in every smile. He started to build the architecture of control that would eventually define his rule. He didn't want to be loved. He wanted to be unavoidable. He turned his ravens into a surveillance network, eyes that would never blink and never trick him. He became a prisoner of his own mind, locked in a constant battle with a fate that he didn't fully understand. He was a king who was more afraid of being wrong than he was of being a tyrant. He spent his days in the dark, whispering to his birds and waiting for the world to reveal its true face. The lore suggests that Odin's obsession with Mimir was a direct result of that first trick. He kept the man close, not out of friendship, but to ensure that Mimir could never use that wisdom against him again. He treated Mimir like a book he could open whenever he wanted, but ignoring the humanity of the person he'd claimed as an advisor. He was trying to reclaim the eye he'd lost by keeping the man who'd taken it in a golden cage. It was a relationship built on spite and intellectual pride, a reflection of how Odin approached everything in his life. He didn't want a partner, he wanted a witness to his own brilliance. He was a god who had forgotten how to listen, because he was too busy trying to overhear the universe. Every decision Odin made from that point on was filtered through the lens of his paranoia. He saw enemies in the shadows of Midgard and spies in the halls of Vanaheim. He started to plan the genocide of the giants because they were the only ones who could see the future without having to hang from a tree. He hated their natural gift because it made his own sacrifice look like a mistake. He was a man who had mutilated himself for a secret and then found out the secret was a joke. He spent the rest of his life trying to make the universe pay for that joke, and he was willing to burn every realm to do it. The first signs of obsession were the last signs of his soul. The peace of the 9 realms was shattered by a failure of patience and a lack of respect. The war began after the Vanir god Freya visited Asgard with the genuine intent to teach the Aesir the secrets of magic and crop-yielding techniques. He brought with him the wisdom of Vanaheim, hoping to build a bridge between the two pantheons through the shared work of growth and spirit. But the Aesir weren't built for the slow, subtle work of nature. They grew impatient with the discipline required to master Sidra magic and the time it took for the earth to respond to their call. They wanted the power of the Vanir without the effort, and when they couldn't grasp it, their frustration turned into a cold, directed anger. The Aesir wrongly blamed Freya for their own failures, convinced that he was deliberately withholding the true secrets of his magic. They saw his calm as a taunt and his wisdom as a weapon. In an act of senseless violence, they attempted to burn Freya alive inside the halls of Asgard. But the lore suggests that a god of nature isn't so easily consumed by the fires of man. Freya escaped the flames and fled back to Vanaheim, carrying the marks of the Aesir's betrayal with him. This was the spark that triggered a massive revenge war, a conflict that would tear the realms apart for generations. The Aesir had tried to kill a guest, and in doing so, they had killed the only hope for a peaceful world. Imagine the return of Freya to his home, his body scarred and his spirit broken by the gods of Asgard. The Vanir were a peaceful people, but they weren't weak, and the attack on their prince was a challenge they couldn't ignore. They saw the Aesir as a plague of metal and ego that threatened to choke the life out of the universe. Odin, for his part, didn't apologize for the violence. He saw Freya's escape as an insult to his authority and used the incident to frame the Vanir as dangerous radicals who needed to be suppressed. He wasn't interested in a lesson in magic anymore. He was interested in a campaign of conquest. He turned a cultural exchange into a declaration of war, and he did it with a smile on his face. The war was a clash of fundamental truths that could never be reconciled. The Aesir fought with the belief that might makes right, that the strongest should dictate the shape of the world. The Vanir fought with the power of the realms themselves, using the wind and the trees as extensions of their will. Every battle was a struggle between the machine of Asgard and the heart of Vanaheim. Odin led his soldiers with a clinical precision, treating every death as a necessary sacrifice for his grand design. He didn't care about the fields that were burned or the families that were destroyed, only the count of his enemies' heads. He was a man who had decided that if he couldn't learn the magic, he would simply destroy the people who knew it. But here's the problem. The Vanir were more resilient than Odin anticipated. They didn't break under the weight of the Aesir's hammers, and they didn't flee from the fire of their dragons. They fought with a desperation that was born from the knowledge that their entire way of life was at stake. Freya, the sister of the burned prince, rose to lead her people with a resolve that matched Odin's own. She turned her grief into a strategic advantage, using her mastery of Seder to turn the Aesir's own strength against them. The war wasn't a quick victory for the Allfather, but a long, slow rot that consumed both sides. The peace of the early days was a memory, replaced by the constant sound of iron on shields. Odin's desperation grew as the war stretched on, his mind already looking for a shortcut to the finish line. He had started a conflict he couldn't win, and his ego wouldn't allow him to admit he was wrong. He watched as the realms were ravaged by the magic and the steel, and he saw it only as a delay in his search for the mask. He was a king who was willing to lose everything just to prove he was the master of the world. The war with the Vanir was the moment Odin's mask of the wise leader began to crack, revealing the cold, hungry god that sat beneath. He had traded a teacher for a war, and he was ready to pay any price to win it. The Aesir-Vanir war quickly settled into a prolonged stalemate that defined a generation of suffering. It was a perfect mismatch of power that left the realms in a state of permanent ruin. The Aesir's traditional combat prowess was legendary. Their soldiers trained for a lifetime to be the most efficient killers in existence. They could level cities and break armies through pure might and iron. But this strength was matched by the Vanir's mastery of nature and Seder magic, a force that didn't follow the rules of a traditional battlefield. The Aesir would charge into a forest only to find the trees moving to block their path, and the ground opening to swallow their horses. It was a war of the sword against the spirit, and neither could find a killing blow. Both realms were ravaged by the constant back and forth of the conflict. Vanaheim's lush forests were scorched by Asgardian fire, while the outskirts of Asgard were choked by magical vines that refused to die. The lore suggests that the very air of the 9 realms became heavy with the weight of the magic being thrown across the borders. Families were split between the sides, and the common people of Midgard were caught in the crossfire of gods who had forgotten why they were fighting. Odin watched the maps in his lodge, seeing only a grid of failed assaults and wasted lives. He didn't see the tragedy of the stalemate, only the inefficiency of his own military machine. The Vanir were led by Freya with a ferocity that stunned the Aesir. She used her magic not just for defense, but to disrupt the very foundation of the Aesir's society. She could turn a warrior's own fear against him, or hide an entire army in a patch of fog. The Aesir grew frustrated. Their pride stung by the fact that they couldn't crush a group of gods who spent their time talking to plants. They doubled down on their violence, committing atrocities that only served to harden the resolve of the Vanir. It was a cycle of escalation that had no natural end, a fire that was burning through the resources of the realms without ever producing a winner. Eventually, the sheer exhaustion of the conflict led the leadership of both sides to consider a compromise they previously thought unthinkable. The Aesir were running out of soldiers, and the Vanir were running out of land. Both pantheons were facing the reality that if they didn't stop, there would be nothing left to rule. Odin's advisors, including the wise Mimir, began to whisper that a victory through force was a dream that had turned into a nightmare. They saw the stalemate for what it truly was, a slow death for the gods themselves. But Odin wasn't a man who enjoyed compromise. He saw it as a personal failure of his own intellect. Imagine the meetings in the dark halls of Asgard, where the toll of the war was finally being calculated. The reports were full of names of the dead and descriptions of lands that could no longer grow food. The Allfather's ravens brought back stories of a world that was tired of the noise of Asgardian iron. Even the Einherjar, the dead warriors Odin had collected, were showing signs of a fatigue that even death couldn't cure. The Vanir were equally drained, their magic flickering as the life force of the realms was squeezed to the breaking point. The stalemate was a physical weight that everyone was carrying, a shadow that wouldn't lift until someone had the courage to put down their weapon. The lore suggests that the decision to seek peace was born from desperation rather than wisdom. Neither side wanted to admit they couldn't win, so they looked for a way to stop without losing their dignity. Odin saw a path that would allow him to get what he wanted through words instead of war. He realized that if he couldn't break the Vanir, he could try to absorb them. He started to listen to the talk of a truce, not because he wanted peace, but because he saw a new opportunity to steal the secrets he'd been fighting for. The stalemate was over, but the war was just moving into a different room. The fire was going out, but the smoke was just as thick as ever. The peace that finally ended the bloodshed was a political marriage proposed by Mimir, a plan designed to bind the two pantheons together through blood and ceremony. It was a desperate move to save the realms from total destruction, and it required a sacrifice that would haunt the future of the Nine Realms. Odin agreed to marry his deadliest enemy, Freya, the leader of the Vanir. While the world saw this as a grand union of two warring houses, the truth was far colder. Odin only agreed to the marriage so he could secretly learn the secrets of Vanir magic, specifically the ability to manipulate fate and cross between realms with ease. He didn't want a partner, he wanted an internal source. Freya accepted the proposal as a selfless act of sacrifice for her people. She knew that if she didn't marry the Allfather, the war would resume until Vanaheim was nothing but a memory. She walked into the halls of Asgard with her head held high, knowing she was trading her personal freedom for the survival of the Vanir. The wedding was a massive event, a spectacle of peace that the realms had been praying for. But underneath the celebration, the tension was still sharp. The Aesir and the Vanir stood on opposite sides of the room, their hands still hovering near their hilts. It was a peace built on the edge of a blade, a fragile truce that everyone was too tired to break. Now here's the problem. Odin's interest in Freya was always an interrogation disguised as a marriage. From the moment the vows were spoken, he began to probe her for the secrets of Seder. He was patient, she using a facade of affection to lower her guard and make her believe that he truly wanted to learn from her. He presented himself as a weary king who wanted to use her magic for the good of all the realms. But the lore suggests that he was already taking notes on how to dismantle her power. He wasn't building a life with her. He was conducting an intelligence operation in his own bedroom. He was a man who saw a wife as a research project, and he was determined to finish it. The peace was never about healing the wounds of the war, but about moving the conflict into a more manageable space. Odin used the marriage to gain access to the diplomatic channels of Vanaheim, slowly integrating their world into his own bureaucracy. He used Freya's presence to legitimize his rule over her people, making it harder for them to resist his creeping influence. He was winning, with a pen, what he couldn't win with a hammer. He made sure that Freya felt isolated in Asgard, surrounding her with his own loyalists, while he systematically drained her of her cultural knowledge. He was a master of the slow rot, a king who knew that a cage doesn't have to be made of iron to keep someone trapped. Mimir, the man who had proposed the peace, likely watched with a growing sense of regret. He had wanted to save the world, but he had handed the most dangerous woman in the realms to the most dangerous man. He saw the way Odin looked at Freya, not with love, but with the cold hunger of a student who was ready to kill his teacher. The peace was a lie that they all told themselves because the alternative was too terrible to face. They wanted to believe that the gods could change, that the Allfather could be a husband, and the Vanir queen could be a queen of Asgard. But the law suggests that nature doesn't change just because you put on a wedding ring. Ultimately, the peace was a countdown to a different kind of disaster. Odin was getting what he wanted, but he was creating a resentment that would eventually burn Asgard to the ground. He was building a bridge from the blood of the people who trusted him, and he didn't care who fell off the side as long as he reached the other end. He sat in his lodge, listening to Freya's stories of the Vanir magic, and planned how he would use it to stop his own death. The peace was a costume he wore to the party, and he was already looking for the exit. He was the Allfather of a world that was pretending to be whole, while he waited for the first crack to show. Before the shadow of Asgard fell over her life, Freya was the high goddess and queen of the Vanir, a figure of immense power and independence. She was a legendary warrior whose name was spoken with respect in every realm. Her skill with a blade matched only by her strategic mind. She led her people through the brutal years of the war with absolute resolve, never wavering in her commitment to the defense of Vanaheim. She was a genius of cider magic, a master who understood the flow of life and death better than any other living being. She was a queen who didn't need a king to justify her existence, a ruler whose authority was born from her own strength and wisdom. Freya's relationship with her brother, Freya, was the core of her world, a bond built on shared history and mutual protection. She saw herself as the guardian of his vision for a peaceful world, and his near death at the hands of the Aesir was a wound she would carry forever. She wasn't just a god of nature. She was the heart of the Vanir culture, a woman who valued the connection between all things above the ego of the individual. She was independent and fierce, a being who could command the wind and the rain with a single word. The lore suggests that she was a master of the internal world as much as the external, a person who found strength in the quiet rhythms of the realms. Imagine a queen who moved through the forests of Vanaheim with the grace of a hunter and the certainty of a god. She didn't seek the approval of others, and she didn't fear the judgment of the Aesir. She was her own master, her magic an extension of her very soul. She could heal a broken body or break a focused mind, and she did it all with a poise that made the gods of Asgard look like children. She was the symbol of everything the Vanir were, resilient, fluid, and deeply tied to the energy of the universe. She was a woman who had built a world that worked, a society that flourished in the light of her guidance. The lore suggests that Freya was also a woman of deep passion and loyalty. She fought not for glory, but for the safety of the people who called her mother and queen. She was willing to endure any hardship and face any enemy if it meant a better future for Vanaheim. This selflessness was a trait that made her a great leader, but it was also a vulnerability that a man like Odin would eventually exploit. He saw her love for her people as a handle he could use to pull her into his orbit. But before he entered the picture, that passion was her greatest shield, a fire that kept the darkness of the war at bay. Her mastery of cider was so total that even the Allfather's curiosity was piqued. She understood that magic isn't just a set of spells, but a relationship with the fabric of reality. She could see the threads that connected the realms and pull at them to change the outcome of a battle or the path of a storm. This gave her a perspective that was vaster than any military strategy or bureaucratic plan. She was a god who lived in the present while seeing the echoes of the past and the whispers of the future. She was the pinnacle of Vanir divinity, a being who was as ancient as the world and as fresh as the first bloom. Odin saw this power and knew he had to have it, not to understand it, but to own it. He looked at the Queen of the Vanir and saw a prize that would complete his collection of stolen truths. He knew that as long as she remained free, she would always be a threat to his dominance. So he set his sights on her, crafting the peace plan that would eventually turn the high goddess into a prisoner. He knew her heart was her only weakness, and he was ready to use it against her. But before the cage was built, Freya was a woman of the wind and the light, a queen who answered to no one but the life of the realms. Freya didn't walk into Asgard with a heart full of hope or a spirit ready for romance. Historical fragments imply she loathed the very thought of the Allfather, viewing him as a shadow that had spent years trying to swallow her world. To her, Odin wasn't a suitor. He was the man who had tried to destroy her home and murder her brother. Every interaction was coloured by the smoke of the Vanir War and the screams of her people. She only agreed to meet him because she realized that the conflict had reached a point where only a massive sacrifice could stop the total slaughter of the Vanir. She wasn't looking for a husband, but a way to buy her people another day of life. Their initial meeting was a cold affair held under the watchful eyes of two exhausted pantheons. Accounts tell us that Freya stood before Odin not as a submissive bride, but as a queen who was making a deal with a monster. She carried the weight of Vanaheim on her shoulders, every step heavy with the knowledge that she was trading her soul for a truce. Odin, ever the master of the mask, presented himself with a quiet dignity that hid his true hunger. He spoke of peace and unity, weaving words that sounded like healing but felt like a net. Freya saw through the charm, recognizing the predator behind the polite smile. Yet she stayed because the alternative was the end of everything she loved. The decision to marry him was a selfless act of sacrifice that defined the kind of goddess she was. Whispers claimed that her own advisors begged her to reconsider, fearing that she was walking into a trap from which there was no escape. But Freya knew that as long as the war continued, the realms would keep bleeding until there was nothing left to save. She chose to be the shield for her people, placing herself in the heart of Asgard to act as a buffer against Odin's violence. It's a tragic image to consider, a goddess of light and growth, deliberately stepping into a hall of iron and secrets to save a world that was already half broken. Odin's interest in her was purely clinical from the start. He didn't see a woman to love. He saw a vault of magic that he didn't have the key to yet. He viewed their meeting as the final stage of a conquest that he'd failed to win on the battlefield. He was patient, knowing that if he pushed too hard, she would retreat back into her magic. He played the part of the weary king, a man who just wanted to end the noise of the hammers and find a quiet path forward. He made sure that Freya felt like her presence was the only thing keeping the peace, using her own sense of duty as a chain to keep her close. Imagine the atmosphere in the room as these two titans faced each other for the first time without weapons. The air was likely thick with the smell of old blood and new lies. Freya's loathing was a physical force, a wall that even Odin's silver tongue couldn't easily breach. She looked at the man who had ordered the burning of her brother and saw a debt that could never be truly paid. But she also looked at the faces of her people and saw their exhaustion. She made the choice that a queen makes, setting aside her own heart to become a hostage to the peace. It was a meeting that would change the history of the 9 realms. But for Freya, it was just the beginning of a long, quiet death. As the ceremony approached, Freya found herself isolated in a city that didn't want her. The Aesir looked at her with a mix of suspicion and greed, wanting her magic but hating her origin. She moved through the Great Lodge like a ghost, a reminder of a war that no one wanted to remember. Odin was the only one who sought her out, always probing, always questioning, always trying to find the crack in her resolve. He wasn't interested in her comfort, only her compliance. By the time the vows were spoken, the law suggests that Freya had already accepted that her life was no longer her own. She was the price of the peace, and she was ready to pay it. The marriage of Odin and Freya took place at a sacred shrine in Vanaheim, a location chosen to symbolize the supposed union of the 2 worlds. It was meant to be a moment of grand reconciliation, a day when the iron of Asgard and the spirit of Vanaheim finally met in a peaceful embrace. Mimir noted that for a short time they even seemed happy, a rare window of calm in a history defined by storms. This period of relative peace coincided with the birth of their son, Baldur, a child who was meant to be the living bridge between the 2 pantheons. For a few years, it appeared that the sacrifice Freya had made might actually result in a world that wasn't defined by the sound of falling hammers. However, historical records imply that Odin's attention was never truly on his family. Even in the moments that looked like domestic bliss, his mind was divided between his wife and his secret research into her magic. He wasn't a husband participating in a life. He was a scientist observing a specimen. He watched the way Freya interacted with the realms, taking notes on the subtle shifts in the air whenever she used the Seder. He used their time together to ask questions that seemed innocent, but were designed to map the boundaries of her power. He was always working, always calculating, and always looking for the one secret that would give him the control he craved. The birth of Baldur provided Odin with a new variable to study. He saw his son not as a child to be nurtured, but as a potential weapon or a tool for his own survival. He watched the boy with a clinical intensity. She is searching for the intersection of Aesir strength and Vanir magic. Freya, conversely, poured all of her love into Baldur, seeing him as the only good thing to come out of her deal with the Allfather. She tried to shield him from his father's coldness, creating a world of warmth and magic within the stony walls of Asgard. This fundamental difference in how they viewed their son was the first sign that the marriage was built on a foundation of sand. Odin's divided attention started to wear on Freya as the years went on. She began to realize that the moments of happiness were just a performance, a way for the Allfather to keep her compliant while he stole the wisdom of her people. She saw him retreating into his private chambers for days at a time, whispering to his ravens and studying the fragments of the mask. He was a man who was physically present but spiritually absent, his soul already consumed by the hunt for the rift. The lore suggests that the marriage was a cage with gold bars, and Freya was starting to feel the weight of every single one of them. Despite the growing distance, they maintained the appearance of a united front for the sake of the realms. They appeared together at feasts and diplomatic summits, the perfect image of a king and queen who had ended a war. But the silence between them in private was deafening. Odin didn't want a partner to talk to. He wanted a source to extract from. He grew impatient with Freya's refusal to share the deeper secrets of the old magic, his frustration manifesting as a cold, biting sarcasm. He stopped pretending to care about the Vanir, his actions in the other realms becoming more aggressive and less concerned with the truce he'd signed. The law suggests that the breaking point for the marriage was always inevitable. You can't build a life on a lie, especially a lie as big as the one Odin was telling. He had married Freya to win a war he couldn't finish with steel, and once he felt he had enough information, the marriage became an anchor he was ready to cut. Freya, too, was reaching the end of her patience. She saw the man her husband truly was, a god who would sacrifice his own family for a glimpse into a void. The birth of Baldur had brought them a few years of peace, but it wasn't enough to change the nature of the Allfather. The mask was slipping, and the monster beneath was ready to show its face. Odin's primary goal in his marriage to Freya was the systematic extraction of Vanir magic to bolster his own power. He was a master of the slow game, spending years encouraging her to share the secrets of Seder, under the guise of mutual understanding. Accounts tell us that Freya did teach him certain spells, showing him how to weave the energy of the realms to create the Bifrost bridges and manipulate the fabric of reality. She hoped that by sharing this knowledge, she could make him see the world as she did, as a living thing that required care rather than control. But Odin wasn't a student of nature. He was a pirate of divinity, taking the tools she gave him and using them to build his surveillance state. There was a limit to what Freya would share, as she adamantly refused to teach him the old magic, the deep, primal Seder that sat at the heart of the Vanir soul. She knew that giving Odin access to that power would be like handing a torch to a man who wanted to watch the world burn. This refusal drove Odin into a quiet, simmering rage. He couldn't stand the idea of a secret he couldn't possess, especially one held by his own wife. He began to pressure her, using their relationship and the safety of the Vanir as leverage to try and force her hand. He didn't want to understand the magic. He wanted to own it so that no one else could ever use it against him. The most significant piece of knowledge Odin craved was the protection spell Freya had placed on their son, Baldur. After a prophecy foretold a needless death for the boy, Freya used her mastery of the Cider to make him invulnerable to all things, both physical and magical. Odin didn't see this as a mother's desperate attempt to save her child. He saw it as a tactical advantage he wanted for himself. He demanded that she grant him the same invulnerability, believing that it was the only way to ensure he would survive the fires of Ragnarök. He saw his own life as more important than the balance of the realms, and he was willing to strip his wife of her most precious magic to secure his own future. Freya's refusal to grant him invulnerability was the final nail in the coffin of their relationship. She saw that his need for the spell wasn't born of fear for his life, but of a desire to become a god who was completely beyond the reach of consequence. She knew that a man like Odin, if made invulnerable, she would become a tyrant without limit. She chose to protect the realms from her husband, even if it meant facing his wrath. This act of defiance was something Odin couldn't forgive. He viewed her withholding of the magic as an act of treason against the Allfather, a personal insult to his intellect and his right to rule. Historical fragments imply that Odin used the magic he did steal to create the architecture of his control. He used the secrets of realm travel to build the temple in the Lake of Nine, not to foster peace, but to ensure that his soldiers could reach any corner of the world in a matter of seconds. He used the cider to create his spectral ravens, turning the magic of life into a tool for a totalitarian surveillance network. He was a man who took the beauty of Vanaheim and turned it into the cold efficiency of Asgard. He didn't build anything new. He just repurposed the brilliance of others to serve his own growing obsession with the end of the world. The lore suggests that by the time Odin was finished with her, he had taken enough to make himself the most dangerous being in the Nine Realms. but not enough to satisfy his hunger. He was a man who had hollowed out his marriage to fill his library. He looked at Freya and saw only the secrets she still held, her humanity long since discarded in his quest for power. He had used her as a filter for the magic he didn't understand, and now that he had what he could get, he was ready to dispose of the source. The knowledge he stole was the foundation of his empire, but it was also the weight that would eventually pull it all down. The breaking point for Freya came when the gap between the man she married and the monster he had become was too wide to ignore. The law suggests that she could no longer stomach the escalating atrocities being committed in the name of the Allfather. Specifically, the genocide of the giants in Midgard was a horror that she couldn't reconcile with her role as a protector of life. She watched as Odin turned their son, Thor, into a genocidal engine, sending him to slaughter a peaceful race just because they held a future he couldn't control. She realized that Asgard wasn't a city of gods, but a factory of death, and she was the one who had helped power the machines. Odin's obsession with Ragnarök had reached a fever pitch, and he was no longer bothering to hide the cruelty of his methods. He was treating the 9 realms as a laboratory for his own survival, and his family was just another set of subjects to be tested. Freya saw the way he looked at Baldur, not with the eyes of a father, but with the eyes of a craftsman checking a tool for flaws. She realized that Odin didn't care about the suffering he caused, only the data he could gather from it. She saw that her presence in Asgard wasn't a bridge to peace, but a shield that allowed Odin to claim a legitimacy he didn't deserve. The corruption of their son, Baldur, was the final wound that wouldn't heal. Freya saw the psychological toll her own protection spell was taking on the boy, as he grew cold and distant in a world where he could feel nothing. She turned to Odin for help, hoping they could find a way to save their son's mind together. But Odin didn't see a problem. He saw a perfect agent who could go into any danger and return with the information he needed. He dismissed her concerns as the overreactions of a mother, ignoring the fact that his own son was losing his soul to the very magic that was supposed to save him. Freya realized that by staying with Odin, she was becoming an accomplice to his crimes. She understood that her silence was a form of consent, and her magic was being used to build a world that she hated. She decided that she had to leave, even if it meant restarting the war between the Aesir and the Vanir. She was willing to lead her people into battle once again, if it meant standing for the truth. She gathered what dignity she had left and confronted the Allfather, she declaring that their marriage was over and that she was returning to Vanaheim. She was a queen reclaiming her crown, a warrior reclaiming her spirit. Whispers claim that Odin's reaction to her declaration was a chilling silence. He didn't argue or beg. He simply looked at her with that one cold eye and calculated the cost of her departure. He didn't see a woman who was suffering. He saw a piece of property that was trying to walk out the door. He knew that if Freya returned to her people, she would become the rallying point for a rebellion that could actually threaten his rule. He couldn't let her go, not because he loved her, but because he couldn't afford to lose the leverage she represented. He had spent years breaking her, and he wasn't about to let her mend herself on someone else's time. The lore suggests that Freya's attempt to leave was the bravest thing she had ever done, but it was also the most dangerous. She was challenging the man who had murdered a creator and hung himself from the world tree. She was walking away from the most powerful throne in existence to live as a hermit in a forest, because she would rather be alone than be part of a lie. It was a moment of pure moral clarity in a world of grey, a goddess choosing the light even as the darkness was closing in. But Odin was a man who didn't believe in choices that he hadn't approved, and he was already preparing the cage that would keep her in Midgard forever. Odin's retaliation for Freya's defiance was a masterclass in psychological and physical cruelty. He didn't just punish her. He dismantled her identity as a goddess and a warrior. In an act of pure spite, he stripped her of her Valkyrie wings, the symbols of her authority over the dead, and her ability to move between the realms. He used his stolen magic to tear away her warrior spirit, casting a spell that rendered her physically unable to cause harm to any living thing. He turned the High Queen into a victim, a woman who could feel every wound of the world, but was forbidden from fighting back. He didn't kill her, because death would have been a mercy he wasn't willing to grant. The cage he built for her was the realm of Midgard itself. He used his magic to bind her to the earth, ensuring that she could never leave the realm or return to her home in Vanaheim. To make the imprisonment absolute, he tied the very roots of Yggdrasil into a knot around her spirit. Tales recount that he even corrupted the dragon Nidhogg, setting the beast to guard the boundaries of her prison. If Freya ever tried to step beyond the limits Odin had set, the dragon would automatically drag her back. A physical reminder that she was no longer a free being. She was a bird with clipped wings, trapped in a garden that had become a cell. The lore suggests that the true cruelty of the curse was the isolation it imposed. Freya was left alone in a forest, surrounded by animals and spirits, but cut off from the gods and the people she loved. She had to watch from a distance as Odin continued his genocide of the giants and his corruption of their son. She could see the world falling apart and knew exactly how to fix it, but her hands were tied by the Allfather's spite. She spent centuries in that forest, her grief turning into a cold, hard resentment that would eventually become her only source of strength. She was a goddess of life who was forced to live in a world that was dying, and she was the only one who knew why. Odin presented the curse to the rest of the Aesir as a necessary measure for the security of Asgard. He claimed that Freya had become unstable, and that her magic was a threat to the stability of the realms. He used his control over the narrative to turn her into a tragic figure, a fallen queen who had lost her mind. He wanted to make sure that no one would go looking for her or try to break the spell. He was a master of the gaslight, making the victim look like the villain so he could keep his hands clean. He sat in his lodge and watched through his ravens as Freya withered in her forest. She satisfied that he had finally won the war. Imagine the feeling of the roots of the world tree pulling at your soul every time you tried to walk toward the horizon. That was the daily reality for Freya. She was a being made for movement and growth, now forced into a static existence by the man who had claimed to be her husband. She lost her connection to the Vanir, her brother, and her son, all in a single stroke of Aesir magic. The cage wasn't just made of trees and dirt. It was made of every secret she had ever shared with Odin, and every vulnerability he had ever mapped. He had used her own love for the realms to bind her to them, a final, bitter irony that she could never forget. The lore suggests that Odin believed the curse would break her spirit, and eventually lead her to crawl back to Asgard and beg for his forgiveness. He thought that if he took away everything she was, she would have nothing left but him. But he underestimated the resilience of a Vanir queen. Freya didn't break. She endured. She built a new life in that forest, learning to use her healing magic in ways that didn't involve violence. She became the Witch of the Woods, a figure of mystery and power who waited for the day the Allfather's luck would finally run out. The cage was strong, but the woman inside was stronger, and she was already planning her revenge. In the early days of the Aesir's rise to power, Tyr was the shining light of Asgard, the sun who represented the potential for a world built on justice rather than fear. He was Odin's original god of war, but his approach to conflict was fundamentally different from his father's. Where Odin saw a battlefield as a place to impose his will, Tyr saw it as a place to establish a lasting order. He was a mediator by nature, a god who preferred to use his words and his wisdom to resolve disputes before the hammers had to be raised. He was the one who could walk into a room of enemies and walk out with a peace treaty, a skill that Odin genuinely valued because it allowed him to consolidate his power without always having to bleed for it. Odin's relationship with Tyr was one of the few genuine connections the Allfather ever had, or at least as close to genuine as a man like that could manage. He saw Tyr as the son he wished he could be, a diplomat who brought the world to Asgard's feet through respect and moral authority. He used Tyr as his primary negotiator, sending him to resolve the most difficult conflicts across the 9 realms. It was Tyr who initially brokered the peace agreements with the giants, using his own honesty as a guarantee that the Aesir would honor their word. In those early years, it seemed as if the father and son were a perfect team, one providing the might and the other providing the meaning. The lore suggests that Tyr's role as the god of war was about the defense of the weak and the upholding of the law. He didn't fight for glory or for the acquisition of secrets. He fought because someone had to stand between the innocent and the dark. He was a man of absolute integrity, a god who believed that his word was a sacred bond. This made him immensely popular across the realms, a figure that people turned to when they needed a fair judgment or a protector. Odin watched this popularity with a mix of pride and a growing, quiet concern. He liked that Tyr was respected, but he started to realize that the realms loved the son more than they feared the father. Tyr's travels were the beginning of the distance between him and Odin. As he visited other pantheons and learned about their cultures, he began to see that the Aesir's way of life was just one among many. He brought back relics and stories of peace from distant lands, trying to show his father that there was more to existence than the pursuit of Ragnarök. He was building a vision of a multicultural alliance, a world where the 9 realms could coexist in a state of mutual respect. He wanted to build bridges, while Odin was already starting to build the walls of his fortress. The 2 gods were moving in opposite directions, and the collision was only a matter of time. Imagine the conversations in the Great Lodge when Tyr returned from one of his journeys. He would speak of the wisdom of the Greeks or the architecture of the Egyptians, his eyes full of the wonder of the world. Odin would listen with a polite smile, but his mind was already turning over the tactical value of the information his son was providing. He didn't care about the beauty of the other cultures. He only cared about how they could be used to secure his own future. He started to see Tyr's diplomacy as a potential vulnerability, a way for enemies to slip through the cracks of his defense. He began to doubt his son's commitment to the Aesir's dominance, and that doubt was the first seed of the betrayal to come. The lore suggests that Tyr was the original conscience of the Aesir, the man who kept the Allfather's worst impulses in check. As long as Tyr was at his side, Odin felt he had a claim to being a just and righteous king. But as Odin's obsession with the prophecy grew, The voice of justice became an annoyance. He didn't want a mediator anymore. He wanted an enforcer. He started to pull away from his son, surrounding himself with men who would tell him what he wanted to hear. Tyr remained loyal, believing that he could still save his father from himself. But he was already losing the battle for Odin's soul. The early days of peace were fading, and the god of war was about to find out that his father's love was just another secret that could be traded away. Tyr was a god of the open road and the distant horizon, a traveler who spent centuries visiting other pantheons and learning the truths of the world. He didn't go as a conqueror, but as a student, seeking to understand the cultures of Greece, Egypt, Japan, and the Maya. He gathered relics and symbols of peace from every land he visited, building a collection of wisdom that was meant to be shared with all the 9 realms. He was a man who believed that the more we know about each other, the less we have to fear. He was building a multicultural alliance, a vision of a world where different gods and different peoples could live in a state of balance and mutual respect. His greatest achievement was the construction of the temple in the Lake of Nine, a massive project designed to facilitate faster and more peaceful travel between the realms. He wanted to make it easy for the people of the 9 realms to visit each other, to trade their goods and their stories without the threat of war. He worked with the giants of Jotunheim to build the temple, using their architectural genius and his own diplomacy to create a neutral ground for all. It was a monument to his belief in the unity of the world, a place where the Bifrost bridges could be accessed by anyone who sought to learn. He was creating a world that didn't need an Allfather to survive, a world where the gods were servants of the people rather than their masters. The lore suggests that Tyr's travels were a direct challenge to Odin's isolationist policies. While Odin wanted to keep the 9 realms under his thumb and the rest of the world at a distance, Tyr was opening the doors and letting the light in. He was bringing back ideas that were dangerous to a tyrant, ideas about justice, equality, and the right of every being to determine their own fate. He was showing the people of Asgard that there were other ways to live, other gods to follow, and other futures to build. He was becoming a figure of hope for the marginalized and the oppressed, a god who wasn't afraid to stand for the truth, even when it was inconvenient for the crown. The relics Tyr gathered were more than just souvenirs. They were a library of the human and divine experience. He had the spear of a Spartan, the mask of a Japanese warrior, and the scrolls of an Egyptian priest. Each piece was a reminder that the world was vast and full of wonder, a world that couldn't be contained by a single prophecy or a single king. He kept these treasures in his vault under the lake, hoping that one day the Aesir would be ready to learn from them. But Odin saw only a collection of foreign variables that needed to be managed. He looked at the temple and saw a strategic asset that he needed to control, a gateway that he didn't want to be open to everyone. Tyr's bond with the giants was the most significant part of what he was building. He recognized their wisdom and their connection to the history of the realms, and he worked tirelessly to ensure their safety. He was the one who helped them establish the Jotunheim Unity, a secret alliance designed to protect their race from the rising tide of Aesir violence. He was a bridge between the giants and the gods, a man who could speak the language of both and find the common ground. He was building a future that was inclusive and fair, a future that didn't have room for a god who wanted to be the author of everyone else's story. Historical fragments imply that Tyr was the most dangerous man in the 9 realms, because he was the only one who could offer a better alternative to Odin's rule. He didn't want to replace his father on the throne. He wanted to dismantle the throne entirely and replace it with a table where everyone could sit as equals. He was building a world of the mind and the heart, a world that was already starting to flourish in the shadows of Asgard. But Odin was watching, and he saw exactly what his son was doing. He saw the temple as a threat and the unity as a betrayal. He knew that if he wanted to keep his power, he had to destroy everything Tyr had built and erase the man who had built it. Odin didn't wake up one morning and decide his son was an enemy, but the lore suggests a cold realization slowly settled over the Allfather. He began to regard Tyr as a threat because his son was a pacifist who prioritized justice over the dominance of the Aesir. In a world built on the idea that might makes right, Tyr's insistence on fairness felt like a quiet rebellion. He wasn't just a god who refused to fight. He was a leader who suggested that Asgard wasn't the center of the universe. This shift in philosophy wasn't just a family disagreement. It was a challenge to the very foundation of Odin's rule. Every time Tyr settled a dispute with a handshake instead of a hammer, he made Odin's methods look like the frantic choices of a desperate man. The popularity of Tyr across the realms was a variable that Odin couldn't manage. Accounts tell us that the people of the Nine Realms didn't just respect Tyr, they loved him with a devotion they never offered to the Allfather. He became a symbol of a different kind of world, one where a god's value wasn't measured by the number of souls in his hall. This made Odin incredibly nervous, as he realized that respect is a much harder thing to kill than fear. He watched from the balconies of Asgard as his son became the face of a unified world, a world that seemed to be outgrowing the need for a single, suffocating king. To a man who defined himself through absolute control, a popular son is the most dangerous kind of rival. The most significant cause for Odin's distrust was Tyr's close bond with the giants of Jotunheim. Tyr didn't just talk to the giants, he understood them, and he worked to unite the realms against the encroaching authority of the Aesir. Odin saw this as a personal betrayal of their blood. He couldn't wrap his mind around the idea that Tyr would help a race of seers keep secrets from their own family. To Odin, the Jotunheim unity wasn't a peaceful alliance. It was a conspiracy designed to blind him to the future. He grew cold because Tyr's diplomacy made the Allfather's need for control look like simple tyranny. He began to see his son not as a diplomat, but as an internal enemy who was slowly dismantling his empire from within. Tyr's efforts to build a neutral ground for the realms were viewed by Odin as a tactical mistake. He looked at the temple and the bridges and saw a landscape that he couldn't easily defend if the world decided to turn against him. He feared that Tyr was building a trap for the Aesir, creating a system that would eventually render their military power obsolete. Odin's mind, already poisoned by the hallucinations of the well, saw a hidden agenda in every peaceful gesture. He convinced himself that Tyr was plotting to replace him, using the love of the realms as a weapon to seize the throne. It's a tragic irony that Tyr never wanted the crown, yet his father's fear made the crown the only thing that mattered. Historical fragments imply that the tension between father and son became a physical weight in the halls of the Great Lodge. Odin stopped asking for Tyr's counsel and started questioning his movements. He used his ravens to track his son's travels, searching for a slip or a secret meeting that would justify his suspicion. He didn't want to find out his son was innocent. He wanted a reason to act. He saw the way the giants looked at Tyr with trust, and the way they looked at him with pity. And that pity was a wound that never stopped bleeding. He was a king who felt his grip slipping, and he decided that if he couldn't own his son's loyalty, he would have to find a way to end his son's influence. By the time the final fracture occurred, Odin had already decided that Tyr was a liability. He saw the god of war as a broken tool, a weapon that had turned its edge back toward the hand that held it. He stopped seeing the justice his son stood for and saw only the obstacles it placed in the way of his search for the mask. He was ready for a breaking point, a moment that would allow him to remove Tyr from the story without turning the realms against Asgard. He just needed a single mistake, a single act of defiance that he could frame as treason. He waited in the shadows of his lodge, watching his son build bridges and prepared the fire that would burn them all down. Part 16. The Breaking Point. The end of the relationship between the Allfather and his son was a disaster born from a single, calculated betrayal. The breaking point occurred when Odin used a peace summit arranged by Tyr to spy on the giants and steal their most protected secrets. Tyr had spent years building the trust necessary for such a meeting, convincing the giants that the Aesir genuinely wanted to find a way to coexist. He put his own honor on the line to guarantee Odin's behavior, believing that even his father could see the value of a lasting truce. But Odin wasn't interested in a truce. He saw the summit as a unique opportunity to gain entry to Jotunheim and map the minds of the seers who had been hiding the future from him. When the giants discovered Odin's espionage, the fallout was immediate and total. They didn't just cancel the meeting. They expelled the Allfather from their presence and cursed his name. The lore suggests that the shame of being caught was what truly broke Odin's mind. He had been humiliated in front of the very people he felt superior to, and he blamed Tyr for the failure. He saw his son's diplomacy not as a noble effort, but as a foolish mistake that had allowed the giants to insult the king of Asgard. He returned to his lodge with a heart full of spite, ready to vent his rage on the son who had led him into such a vulnerable position. Tyr, however, didn't bow to his father's anger. He saw the betrayal for exactly what it was, and decided that his loyalty to the truth was greater than his loyalty to a tyrant. He turned against his father to help the guardian Laufey hide the gate to Jotunheim, effectively cutting Odin off from the realm of the giants forever. This was an act of open treason in the eyes of the Allfather. He watched as his own son worked with his greatest enemy to lock the door to the knowledge he craved. To Odin, this wasn't just a political disagreement. It was a theft of his destiny. He believed he was entitled to the secrets of the giants, and he saw Tyr as the man who had stolen his future. The help Tyr provided to Frey was the final choice that ended his life as a free god. He knew that by assisting her, he was signing his own death warrant. Yet he did it because he believed it was the only way to save the 9 realms from his father's obsession. He used his knowledge of the temple and the Bifrost to ensure that the gate could never be found by Asgardian spies. He chose to be a martyr for a world he would never see, a god who was willing to lose his status and his family for a principle. Odin watched from the shores of the lake as the light of Jotunheim faded, and he knew that his son was the one who had extinguished it. Historical fragments imply that the confrontation between them was a quiet, chilling affair. There were no grand speeches or dramatic fights, and just a father looking at a son and realizing that he could no longer control him. Odin didn't see the justice in Tyr's eyes. He saw only the failure of his own design. He felt a coldness settle over his heart, a realization that he had raised a man who was his opposite in every way that mattered. He decided in that moment that Tyr couldn't be allowed to remain a part of the world. He couldn't kill him yet for fear of a rebellion, but he could make sure that Tyr would never speak to another soul again. The breaking point was the moment the mask of the Allfather was finally cast aside in front of his son. Odin stopped pretending to be a wise ruler and showed Tyr the desperate, hungry god that lived beneath the surface. He saw the disappointment in Tyr's face and hated him for it. He hated that his son was better than him, and he hated that the realms would always remember Tyr as the one who was right. He began to plan the disappearance that would shock the world, a plan to erase his son from history and replace his memory with a lie. The bridge was gone, the gate was sealed, and the Allfather was alone in a world that was starting to look like a cage. Part 17. The imprisonment. Odin removed Tyr from the 9 realms with a surgical precision that left no traces behind. He didn't want a public trial or a noisy execution that would turn his son into a martyr. Instead, he secretly imprisoned Tyr and spread rumors across the realms that the god of war had died in a tragic accident, or had simply vanished into the distant lands he loved so much. He wanted to turn a living god into a memory that he could control and manipulate for his own purposes. By telling the world that Tyr was dead, he prevented anyone from going looking for him, and ensured that his son's influence would slowly fade into the fog of history. He was a master of the quiet removal, a king who knew that a ghost is much easier to manage than a hero. The prison he chose was a deep, dark cell in Asgard, a place so well hidden that even his closest advisors didn't know its location. This cell was eventually moved to a section of the city that crashed in Niflheim during the final days, but for centuries it was Tyr's entire world. Odin kept him alive, not out of a lingering sense of fatherly love, but because he wanted to preserve the option of using Tyr's identity for himself. He knew that if he ever needed to manipulate the other realms, the face of the most trusted god in history would be a powerful tool. He kept his son like a spare suit in a closet, waiting for the day he would need to wear his skin to tell a new lie. The lore suggests that Tyr's life in that cell was a slow, grinding torture of the spirit. He was cut off from the light of the sun and the noise of the world he had tried to save. He had no one to talk to but the Allfather, who would occasionally visit to gloat over his victory or to try and extract one last secret about the giants. Odin wanted to see his son break, to see him admit that his pursuit of justice was a mistake. But Tyr remained silent, his resolve a wall that even the Allfather couldn't breach. He became a living reminder of Odin's failure to control the truth, a prisoner who held more power in his silence than the king held on his throne. The impact of Tyr's disappearance on the other gods was a wave of quiet terror. They saw the most trusted and powerful among them simply vanish without explanation, and they knew instinctively that the Allfather was responsible. They didn't ask questions because they knew the price of curiosity in Odin's Asgard. The halls of the Great Lodge grew colder, and the laughter that had once defined Tyr's company was replaced by the sound of ravens and whispers. Odin used the absence of his son to further consolidate his power, framing himself as the only one left who could protect the Aesir from the growing threats of the world. He turned his son's erasure into a tool for his own expansion. Historical fragments imply that Odin spent years perfecting the magic he would need to impersonate his son. He studied Tyr's mannerisms, his voice, and his way of thinking, preparing for the day he would return to the world as the god of war. He wanted to make sure that when he eventually stepped out of the shadows, no one would suspect the truth. He was a man who was willing to live a lie for decades if it meant he could stay one step ahead of the prophecy. He looked at the man in the cell and saw only a costume, a role to be played in a grand performance that was designed to save his own life. Ultimately, the imprisonment of Tyr was the clearest sign of the rot at the heart of Odin's rule. He had traded his own son for a strategic advantage, proving that there was no line he wouldn't cross to stay in power. He sat in his lodge and watched the world mourn a man who was still breathing, just a few floors below them. He felt a grim satisfaction in the deception, a sense that he had finally outsmarted the universe. But he had created a vacuum that could never be truly filled, and he had planted a seed of resentment that would eventually grow into his own destruction. He was a king who had erased his best light, and he was left to rule a world that was slowly going dark. The giants, or the Jotnar, were far more than just another race of beings in the 9 realms. They were the librarians of time itself. They possessed a natural gift for prophecy that wasn't born of magic or deals with the world tree, but was a fundamental part of their being. They could see the threads of the future as clearly as a man sees the road beneath his feet. This foresight allowed them to understand the true nature of the world and the role that every god and mortal would play in its eventual end. They knew that Odin was a parasite, a man who wanted to drain the universe of its wisdom to feed his own ego. They saw the darkness in him long before he had the chance to hide it behind the title of Allfather. Their ability to see the end of the Aesir made them the only threat that Odin couldn't solve with a hammer or a bribe. He was a man who thrived on being the smartest person in the room, but when he looked at the giants, he realized he was a child playing in the dirt. He hated their silence and their calm, viewing it as a personal insult to his own frantic search for answers. He knew that they held the key to his own death, and their refusal to share that knowledge drove him into a clinical, focused rage. He saw their foresight as a weapon that was being held against him, and he was determined to disarm them before they had a chance to use it. The lore suggests that the giants viewed Odin with a mix of pity and disgust. They saw his sacrifices and his mutilations, and knew that none of it would ever be enough to grant him the wisdom he craved. They understood that you can't steal the truth. You can only live it. This fundamental difference in philosophy created a rift that could never be bridged. The giants wanted to preserve the natural flow of time, while Odin wanted to hijack it and steer it in a direction that kept him on the throne. To the seers of Jotunheim, the Allfather was a tragedy in motion, a man who was so afraid of dying that he had forgotten how to live. Odin's agenda was clear to the giants from the very beginning. He didn't want to learn from them. He wanted to empty them. He saw their culture as a resource to be mined, and their history as a data set to be analyzed. Every time he sent a diplomat or a spy to their borders, the giants saw the hunger in his eyes. They chose to retreat into their own realm and seal the ways, not because they were afraid of a fight, but because they knew that any interaction with Asgard would eventually lead to their destruction. They were a people who valued the integrity of the world above their own survival, a concept that a man like Odin could never truly grasp. Historical fragments imply that the giants' refusal to share their prophecy was the spark that turned Odin's curiosity into a genocidal obsession. He couldn't handle the idea of a secret he couldn't have, especially one that concerned his own fate. He began to frame the giants as a dangerous and deceptive race, convincing the rest of the Aesir that the seers were plotting an invasion of Asgard. He used his control of the narrative to turn the librarians of time into the monsters of the future. He needed a villain for the story he was telling his people, and the giants were the perfect fit because they were the only ones who knew the truth of his lies. The giants of Jotunheim were the only ones who truly understood the price of Odin's rule. They saw the rot in Asgard and the suffering in the other realms, and knew that it was all a result of one man's refusal to accept his own limitations. They died not because they were weak, but because they were the only ones who wouldn't bow to a false god. They left behind a world that was culturally and spiritually hollow, a world that was waiting for someone to find the courage to speak the truth again. Odin thought he had won when he drove them away, but he had only ensured that the only people who could have saved him were the ones he had already destroyed. Part 19. The Prophecy of Ragnarök. The prophecy of Ragnarök was the fixed point around which every decision in Odin's life eventually turned. It foretold the total destruction of Asgard and the death of the Aesir, a catastrophe that would consume the 9 realms and leave nothing but ash behind. For Odin, this wasn't a warning to be heeded or a tragedy to be mourned. It was a personal challenge to his intellect. He became so consumed by the idea of his own end that he built his entire society around the single goal of preventing it. He turned the culture of the Aesir into a military machine, focusing every resource and every soul on the defense of a throne that was already destined to fall. He was a man who was living in a future that he hated, trying to fix a leak in a dam that was already breaking. To facilitate his plan, Odin ordered the creation of Mjolnir, a hammer of such immense power that it could level mountains and shatter the resolve of any army. He didn't want a tool for justice or a symbol of strength. He wanted a weapon for genocide. He saw the giants as the primary threat to his survival, and he wanted a way to erase them from the world with as little effort as possible. He gave the hammer to his son, Thor, and told him that his only value was his ability to use it on his father's behalf. He turned a god of thunder into a blunt instrument of the Allfather's will, a man who would spend his life breaking the world to keep a king safe. The lore suggests that the fear of Ragnarök was the true king of Asgard. Every law, every wall, and every secret was designed to buy Odin one more day of life. He created the Einherjar to provide a wall of bodies. He stole the magic of the Vanir to provide a wall of spirit, and he hunted the giants to provide a wall of foresight. He was building a fortress of fear, convinced that if he could just make the world small enough and controlled enough, the end would never find him. He stopped caring about the prosperity of his people or the health of the realms, seeing them only as fuel for his survival engine. He was a man who had sacrificed the present to a future that he couldn't escape. Imagine the atmosphere in the Great Lodge as the years passed and the prophecy grew closer. The air was likely thick with the sound of hammers and the smell of old parchment. Odin spent his nights staring at the murals he had stolen, searching for a loophole in the lines of fate. He grew more erratic, his decisions driven by the shifting visions he saw in the shadows. He didn't trust his sons, he didn't trust his advisors, and he certainly didn't trust the world. He was a prisoner of his own paranoia, locked in a room with a clock that was ticking towards zero. He was the Allfather of a world that was already in mourning, even if they didn't know it yet. Historical fragments imply that Odin's obsession with the prophecy was what actually ensured it would come true. By trying to control every variable, he created the very resentments and imbalances that led to the final conflict. He was the architect of his own destruction, his hands already stained with the blood of the people who would eventually rise against him. He couldn't see that the only way to stop Ragnarök was to stop being a tyrant. He was so focused on the mechanics of the end that he ignored the spirit of the beginning. He was a god who had forgotten how to be a god, becoming instead a fearful old man who was trying to hold back the tide with a bucket. The prophecy of Ragnarök was the mirror that showed Odin his own reflection, and he couldn't stand the sight. He saw a man who had murdered his way to a throne and lied his way to a family. He saw a god who was more afraid of being forgotten than he was of being a monster. He built a world that was a monument to his ego, and then he was shocked when the world decided it was time to tear the monument down. He sat in his lodge, clutching the fragments of a mask that promised him answers, and waited for the sound of the horn that would tell him his time was up. He was the master of a dying age, and he was the one who had made sure it would die in the most painful way possible. Part 20. The decision to hunt them. The decision to launch a genocidal campaign against the giants was the moment Odin fully embraced his role as the monster of the 9 realms. After being cursed and expelled from Jotunheim, his pride was wounded in a way that he couldn't ignore. He saw their refusal to share their prophecy as a direct attack on his authority and his right to survive. He concluded that if he couldn't own their wisdom, he would have to destroy the people who held it. He didn't arrive at this decision through a sense of justice or a need for defense. It was a purely retaliatory strike, designed to blind the universe to any future that didn't involve him. He was a king who had decided that a world without giants was safer than a world with secrets. To justify the slaughter to the rest of the Aesir, Odin framed the hunt as a necessity to stop the apocalypse. He told his people that the giants were planning an invasion of Asgard, that their seers were weaving spells that would bring the end of all things. He used his control over the ravens and the records to manufacture a threat that didn't exist, turning a peaceful race of scholars into a looming shadow that needed to be erased. He made the Aesir feel like they were the heroes of a story where they were actually the villains. He was a master of the defensive lie, making a preemptive genocide look like a courageous act of survival. The lore suggests that Odin's plan was to strip Midgard of every giant, so that none could ever assist the heroes of the prophecy. He wanted to make sure that when the time came, there would be no one left to guide the ghost of Sparta or the son of Laufey. He saw the giants as the primary variable that he couldn't control, and he was determined to remove them from the equation entirely. He didn't care about the history or the culture that would be lost, and only the tactical advantage of a blank slate. He was a man who would rather rule a graveyard than a world he didn't fully understand. Thor was the primary instrument of this campaign, the hammer that Odin pointed at every giant home in Midgard. The Allfather used his son's need for approval to drive him to commit atrocities that would haunt the thunder god for the rest of his life. He told Thor that every kill was a step toward a safer Asgard, a way to prove his worthiness to the crown. He watched from his lodge as the maps of Midgard were cleared of the giant settlements, feeling a grim satisfaction with every report of a fallen family. He was a father who had turned his son into a murderer to keep himself from having to look at his own future. Historical fragments imply that the hunt was a clinical, organized affair that left no room for mercy. The Aesir didn't just kill the warriors, they destroyed the homes, the libraries, and the very memory of the Jotnar. They wanted to make sure that there was nothing left for the next generation to find. Odin oversaw the entire operation with a cold intensity, his mind already calculating the next phase of his control. He wasn't bothered by the screams or the blood, only by the possibility that a single giant might escape his net. He was a man who had traded his soul for a sense of security that was nothing but a delusion. Ultimately, the decision to hunt the giants was the act that sealed Odin's fate. By trying to prevent the prophecy, he created the very vacuum that allowed the events of Ragnarök to unfold. He had removed the only people who could have offered a different path, leaving the realms in a state of permanent imbalance. He sat in his lodge and watched the smoke rise from the ruins of Midgard, believing that he had finally secured his future. But he had only ensured that his end would be brought about by the very people he had tried to erase. He was a king who had won a war against the truth, and he was left to rule a world that was waiting for the light to return. Part 21. The Extinction of Jotunheim. The campaign in Midgard reached its peak when Odin ordered Thor to slaughter every giant he could find, regardless of their age or their role in the world. This was the Aesir carnage, a period of violence so absolute that it changed the landscape of the realm forever. Thor moved through the lands with a mindless ferocity, his hammer a blur of lightning and death. He broke the great halls and crushed the mountain homes, leaving behind nothing but a silence that was more terrifying than the noise of the war. Odin watched the progress through his ravens, satisfied that the seers who had pitied him were finally being silenced. He didn't see a tragedy. He saw a successful military operation. To protect their race from total annihilation, the surviving giants made a desperate choice to retreat to Jotunheim and seal the way behind them. They knew that as long as the gate remained open, Odin would never stop his hunt. They used the last of their magic to create a barrier that no Aesir could breach, effectively cutting themselves off from the rest of the 9 realms. This wasn't an escape to a better life, but a decision to die in their own home rather than in Odin's cages. They chose a slow extinction over a violent one, leaving behind a world that had become a prison for the god who thought he was its master. The lore suggests that the giants left behind dead bodies as decoys to make Odin believe they had already died out. They wanted him to stop looking, to believe that his work was finished so that they could live out their final days in peace. When Odin's spies reported that the giants in Midgard were gone and that Jotunheim was a realm of the dead, the Allfather felt a sense of triumph. He believed that he had finally outsmarted the seers and erased the threat to his throne. He didn't realize that he had been tricked by the very people he had tried to destroy, a final irony from a race that always saw the end coming. The retreat left the 9 realms culturally and spiritually hollow. The giants had been the keepers of the ancient wisdom and the balance of time, and their absence created a vacuum that Odin filled with his own cold bureaucracy. The other realms grew quiet, the music and the stories of the Jotnar replaced by the sound of Aesir iron and the whispering of ravens. The world was free of the seers, but it was also free of hope. Odin sat on his throne in Asgard and looked out over a world that was finally following his rules, unaware that he was ruling a kingdom of shadows. Historical fragments imply that the loss of the giants was a wound that the realms would never truly recover from. They were the only ones who understood the deep connections between the worlds, and their removal allowed the rot in Odin's rule to spread unchecked. The Allfather became even more isolated, so his only companions, the secrets he had stolen, and the paranoia that was his only friend. He had won his war against the giants, but he had lost the soul of the universe. He was a king who had killed his own teachers, and he was left to wonder why the world felt so small and so cold. The extinction of Jotunheim was the end of the middle age of the world, and the beginning of the long wait for the end. Odin believed he had secured his future, but he had only ensured that there would be no one left to stop the fire when it finally came. He sat in his lodge and watched the snow fall over the ruins of Midgard, a man who had traded everything for a silence he didn't understand. The giants were gone, the gate was sealed, and the Allfather was the only one left to watch the clock. He had won the battle, but the war for the future was just beginning. Part 22. Fae and the Plan That Survived. Laufey the Just, known to most as Fae, was the one giant that Odin's extensive network of ravens could never find. While the Allfather believed he had completed the genocide of the Jotnar, Fae remained hidden in plain sight within the heart of Midgard. She was the guardian of her people, a warrior who understood that the only way to beat a god who controlled the future was to play a much longer game. She didn't hide in a cave or behind a magical wall. She built a life, married a foreign god, and birthed a son who would eventually become the architect of Odin's downfall. She outmaneuvered the Allfather by betting on the strength of a father's love, rather than the cold application of divine power, a variable that Odin's clinical mind could never truly account for. Her presence in Midgard was a constant, quiet threat to the stability of Asgardian rule. Accounts indicate that she worked tirelessly with Tyr to hide the gate to Jotunheim, ensuring that even if Odin found her, he wouldn't find the way home. She was a master of the hidden path, using the trees and the earth to mask her movements from the spectral eyes in the sky. She knew that Odin was a parasite who would drain the world of its wisdom if given the chance, and she made it her life's work to ensure he remained hungry. She wasn't just surviving. She was preparing a landscape for a war that hadn't even begun yet. The plan she left behind was a masterpiece of foresight and intent. Records indicate that she spent her final years marking a path of gold runes across the realms, a trail that only her husband and son could follow. She knew exactly what kind of man Kratos was, and she knew exactly what kind of god Atreus would become. She didn't leave them a set of instructions. She left them a journey that would force them to grow, to bond, and to eventually face the Allfather on their own terms. Her golden path was a sequence of events that Odin's ravens couldn't see, because it was built on individual choices and emotional growth rather than military movements. Some believe that Faye saw the end of the Aesir more clearly than any other giant. She understood that Odin's obsession with the prophecy made him predictable, and she used that predictability to lure him into a trap. By having Kratos and Atreus travel to Jotunheim to spread her ashes, she ensured they would discover the truth of their heritage and the depth of Odin's crimes. She set the wheels of Ragnarök in motion from beyond the grave, proving that a single woman with a plan could be more powerful than a king with 1,000 armies. She was the one variable that Odin couldn't solve, the ghost that haunted his every failed attempt to control the narrative. Imagine the frustration of the Allfather as he realized, too late, that the last giant had been living right under his nose for decades. He had spent centuries searching for the gate, only to find that it was hidden by a woman who had already died. He looked at the runes on the trees and the marks on the mountains, and saw the signature of his own failure. Faye hadn't just defeated him, she had humiliated him by proving that his surveillance state was useless against a person who truly knew how to hide. She had turned his own obsession into the weight that would eventually pull him down, leaving him to chase shadows while the real threat was already at his door. The legacy Faye left behind was the fire that would eventually consume Asgard. She gave Kratos a reason to fight and Atreus a reason to lead, creating a duo that could survive any storm Odin threw at them. She was the architect of the resistance, the woman who had turned the tragedy of her race into a weapon for the future. Her plan survived because it was built on the truth, something that Odin had spent his life trying to erase. In the end, the Allfather's world didn't end because of a grand battle or a cosmic event, but because one giant chose to be a mother and a wife instead of a victim. Odin didn't raise his son Thor to be a king or a leader. He raised him to be an unquestioning enforcer. From the moment the boy could lift a weapon, the Allfather began the process of turning a child into a blunt instrument of the state. He withheld affection as a matter of policy, using it as a rare and precious reward for what he called the butcher's work. He wanted Thor to believe that his only value lay in his usefulness to Asgard, a belief that created a deep, festering well of self-loathing in the god of thunder. Thor grew up in a world where a father's hug was traded for a giant's head, a transaction that broke his soul long before he ever picked up a hammer. The Allfather cultivated Thor's dependency with surgical precision. He made sure that his son felt like a failure in every area except for violence, ensuring that Thor would always return to the battlefield to prove his worthiness. He used shame as a leash, constantly reminding Thor of his mistakes and his shortcomings to keep him from ever questioning his orders. He created a god who was terrified of his own father's disappointment, a man who would rather slaughter 1,000 innocents than face the cold silence of the Allfather's lodge. Odin wasn't interested in a son who could think for himself. He wanted a weapon that would hit whatever it was pointed at. Thor's upbringing was a series of trials designed to strip away his empathy and his humanity. Legends recount that Odin would send him on impossible missions, demanding that he break the things the Allfather couldn't control. He was the one ordered to break Tyr's temple and to hunt down the giants who had insulted the Aesir. Every atrocity Thor committed was a brick in the wall that separated him from the rest of the realms. Odin watched this process with a clinical satisfaction, knowing that a son who hates himself is a son who is easy to manipulate. He was building a monster to guard his throne, and he didn't care about the cost to the boy who wore the crown of lightning. The psychological cage Odin built for Thor was reinforced by the culture of Asgard itself. The Allfather made sure that the other gods looked at Thor with a mix of fear and pity, isolating him even further from anyone who might offer him a different path. He encouraged Thor's descent into alcoholism, seeing it as a way to keep his son dull and compliant between the wars. A drunken, angry Thor was a Thor who wouldn't notice the rot in his father's heart. Odin was a master of the slow destruction of a person, and he practiced his craft on his own flesh and blood with a dedication that was truly terrifying. Imagine the weight of a hammer that is fueled by a father's spite. That was the daily reality for Thor. He carried Mjolnir not as a symbol of his power, but as a symbol of his service. He knew that the moment he stopped being useful, his father would discard him like a broken spear. This fear drove him to ever greater acts of violence, as he tried to fill the void in his heart with the blood of his enemies. He was a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be loved for who he was, instead of what he could do. Odin sat in his lodge and watched his son become a legend of carnage, proud that he had created a weapon that would never turn against him. This toxic cycle of abuse and performance defined the history of the Aesir for generations. Thor became the face of Odin's violence, the shield that allowed the Allfather to keep his own hands clean. But beneath the armor and the lightning, there was a man who was still waiting for a kind word that would never come. Odin had successfully turned his son into an engine of genocide, but he had also ensured that when the end finally came, Thor would have nothing left to fight for. The Allfather had traded a family for a force, and he was ready to watch that force burn itself out if it meant he could stay on his throne for one more day. Shoot Part 24. Thor as the Allfather's enforcer. Thor's primary function in the 9 realms was to serve as the Aesir carnage, the physical manifestation of Odin's will on the battlefield. Historical fragments imply that he was the one responsible for the mass genocide of the giants in Midgard. a campaign of violence that left the realm a scarred and empty place. He didn't fight with the strategic nuance of his father or the diplomatic grace of Tyre. He fought with a mindless, overwhelming ferocity that crushed everything in its path. He was the hammer that broke the world, a god who spent his days wading through the blood of a peaceful race, because his father told him it was necessary for the security of Asgard. The psychological cost of this work was a slow, agonizing descent into a broken soul. Thor lived in a constant cycle of violence and alcoholism, trying to drown the memories of the families he had destroyed. He knew that he was a monster, but he believed it was the only thing he was allowed to be. He saw himself as a butcher, a man whose hands would never be clean again. This self-image was something Odin reinforced at every opportunity, making sure that Thor never felt worthy of anything better than the life of a killer. He was a god of thunder who spent his nights weeping in the dark, his only comfort the bottle and the fear he inspired in others. Odin used Thor's reputation as a shield for his own public image. By directing his son to do the dirty work, the Allfather could present himself to the realms as an elevated, intellectual ruler who was above the petty violence of war. He could claim that Thor's actions were the unfortunate result of a warrior's nature, rather than the calculated orders of a king. This allowed Odin to maintain a level of diplomatic deniability while reaping the rewards of his son's brutality. He was a master of the hands-off approach, a man who could order a genocide and then sit down for a polite conversation about the nature of the soul. The relationship between Thor and the other realms was one of pure terror. Accounts indicate that people would flee at the first sound of thunder, knowing that the Allfather's enforcer was coming to settle a debt or silence a secret. Thor became the boogeyman of the 9 realms, a figure of mythic cruelty whose name was whispered in the dark. He didn't care about the politics or the reasons behind his orders. He only cared about finishing the job so he could return to Asgard and wait for the next bottle. He was a man who had been stripped of his agency, a god who was nothing more than a shadow of his father's obsession. When Kratos arrived in Midgard, he eventually had to witness the full extent of Thor's broken nature. The ghost of Sparta saw a reflection of his own past in the god of thunder, a man who was being used by a higher power to commit atrocities he didn't believe in. He saw the way Thor's family was suffering under the weight of Odin's expectations, and he saw the flicker of a soul that was still trying to find its way out of the dark. Kratos didn't just see an enemy. He saw a warning of what happens when a son never learns how to say no to a monster. The confrontation between them was a collision of 2 different ways of dealing with a father's legacy. Ultimately, Thor's life as an enforcer was a tragedy of wasted potential. He had the strength to be a protector and the power to be a leader, but he was hollowed out by a man who only saw him as a tool. He died not as a hero or a king, but as a victim of a system that had been designed to use him until he broke. Odin watched his son fall and felt only the irritation of losing a valuable asset. He had already moved on to the next phase of his plan, leaving the broken body of the god of thunder in the ruins of the world he had helped destroy. The Allfather's enforcer was gone, and Asgard was left with nothing but the silence of the grave. Part 25. Baldur's role in Odin's world was fundamentally different from Thor's, but no less tragic. While Thor was the hammer, Baldur was the targeted search engine, a specialist sent on missions that required more than just brute strength. Odin sent him to track the last giant in Midgard, because he believed Baldur's invulnerability made him the perfect agent for a task that had frustrated the Aesir for centuries. Because Baldur couldn't feel pain, he could go into environments and face threats that would break any other god. Odin didn't care about the mental state of his son, or the toll that his lack of sensation was taking on his mind. He only cared that Baldur was a tool that wouldn't break before the job was done. Historical fragments imply that Baldur's life was a waking nightmare of sensory deprivation. He lived in a world where he could feel no heat, no cold, and no touch, just a condition that slowly drove him into a state of frantic, aggressive madness. He grew to loathe his mother, Freya, for the spell that had saved his life but taken his soul. Odin used this resentment to his advantage, positioning himself as the only one who understood Baldur's burden. He didn't offer to break the spell. He offered the boy a purpose that would distract him from his emptiness. He gave Baldur a mission and a target, turning his son's suffering into a source of motivation for the hunt. Odin's lack of care for Baldur was evident in how he handled the boy's failures. Every time Baldur returned from Midgard without the giant, the Allfather's disappointment was a cold, sharp blade. He didn't ask how his son was feeling. He asked why the gate hadn't been found. He treated Baldur's invulnerability as a resource to be managed, pushing him to the limits of his endurance to see if a little more pressure would produce a result. He was a man who saw his children as technology, and Baldur was a specialized piece of gear that was currently malfunctioning. The Allfather was always looking for the upgrade, never for the person. The search for the giant in Midgard became an obsession for Baldur, a way to prove that he still had a place in the order of the realms. He became a relentless hunter, his mind focused on the single goal of finding the entrance to Jotunheim. He didn't care about the collateral damage or the lives he ruined along the way. He was a man who was desperately trying to feel something, anything. And he thought that finishing his father's work might be the key. He was a tragic figure, a god who was literally untouchable, yet felt every bit of the isolation that Odin had designed for him. Odin's plan for Baldur was to use him as the final key to the prophecy. He believed that if Baldur could reach Jotunheim, the boy could extract the last secrets of the giants and bring them back to Asgard. This would give Odin the foresight he needed to avert his own death and secure his rule forever. He was willing to sacrifice Baldur's sanity and his life for this goal, seeing it as a fair price for the survival of the Aesir. He sat in his lodge and watched through his ravens as Baldur tore through Midgard, never once considering the possibility that his son might want a different life. He was a king who had replaced fatherhood with a set of objectives. The end of Baldur's story was a disaster that Odin should have seen coming. By pushing his son into a confrontation with the ghost of Sparta, he ensured that the boy would eventually find the one thing that could break his spell. When Baldur finally died, Odin felt a brief moment of shock, followed immediately by a calculation of how to use the death to his advantage. He didn't mourn the son who had spent his life in a sensory prison. He started planning the war that the death would trigger. Baldur was gone, the search for the giant had failed, and the Allfather was already looking for a new way to reach the rift. The tool had broken, and it was time to find a replacement. The mask was the ultimate prize in Odin's long history of theft and obsession, a relic covered in foreign languages that the Allfather believed was the key to looking into a rift in reality. This wasn't just a magical artifact or a symbol of power. It was a cosmic key that promised to unlock the secrets of the universe itself. Odin believed that if he could complete the mask and put it on, he would be able to see through the rift and understand the true meaning of life, death, and the afterlife of the gods. He saw himself as a man who had reached the limits of divine understanding, and was now reaching for the source code of existence. His belief in the mask was fueled by a deep-seated insecurity about his own mortality. He didn't just want to survive Ragnarök. He wanted to become a being who was completely beyond the reach of fate. He believed that the rift held the answers to the questions that had haunted him since the death of Ymir. He thought that by looking into it, he would no longer be a god subject to prophecy, but the author of prophecy himself. He was a man who wanted to step out of the story and become the one who was telling it. This obsession turned the mask into the central focus of his life, a white whale that superseded the needs of his people and the safety of his realms. The lore suggests that the languages on the mask were unlike anything found in the Nine Realms, a fact that both terrified and exhilarated the Allfather. He saw the alien nature of the relic as proof that it came from a place of higher truth, a place that sat above the petty squabbles of the Aesir and the Vanir. He spent centuries trying to decipher the characters. She's sacrificing thousands of scholars and burning through entire libraries in his search for a translation. He was a man who had decided that the world he lived in was a lie, and that the mask was the only way to find the truth. He was willing to risk everything for a single glimpse of what lay on the other side of the veil. Odin's obsession with the mask was a form of madness that colored every interaction he had. He stopped caring about the day-to-day management of Asgard, leaving the details to his underlings while he sat in his private chambers staring at the fragments. He became a recluse, his mind always half focused on the puzzle he couldn't solve. He would talk to the mask as if it were a living thing, a companion that understood him in a way his family never could. He was a god who had traded his connection to the living world for a connection to an object, a transition that left him more isolated than he had ever been. Imagine the atmosphere in the room where Odin kept the mask. The air was likely thick with the smell of old stone and the energy of 1,000 failed spells. Every time a new fragment was found, the Allfather would fall into a feverish state of excitement, convinced that this was the one that would finally reveal the secret. He didn't care about the lives that were lost to find it, or the ruins that were created to extract it. He only cared about the mask. He was building a bridge to a place he didn't understand, and he didn't care if the bridge was made of the bodies of his own people. He was a man who had decided that the truth was worth any price. The mask became a symbol of Odin's refusal to accept the natural order of the world. He saw it as a way to bypass the end and rewrite the rules of the universe to suit his own ends. He was a king who was trying to hack reality, a god who had forgotten that every truth has a cost. He sat in his lodge, clutching the stones and whispering to the dark, waiting for the day he could finally put the mask on and see the face of creation. He was a man who had searched every corner of the Nine Realms and found nothing that satisfied him, and now he was reaching for the one thing that promised to give him everything. Part 27. The Search Across the Nine Realms. The hunt for the fragments of the mask was a centuries-long campaign that spanned every corner of the Nine Realms. Odin obsessed over every lead and every rumor. She's sending his spies and his soldiers to the most dangerous and remote locations in his pursuit of the relic. He destroyed archaeological sites, burned ancient libraries, and sacrificed countless lives just to find a single chip of the stone. He didn't care about the history he was erasing or the cultures he was dismantling. To the Allfather, the entire world was just a pile of rubble that he had to sift through to find his prize. He was a man who had turned the Nine Realms into an excavation site for his own ego. His methods grew more desperate as the years went on, and the prophecy of Ragnarök drew closer. He started to use his ravens to monitor the movements of anyone who might have information about the mask, creating a culture of suspicion that choked the life out of the realms. He would kidnap scholars and interrogate them for years, trying to find a pattern in the chaos of the ruins. He was convinced that the knowledge he sought was the only way to break free of the fate foretold in the murals, and he was willing to burn every bridge to reach it. He was a god who was running out of time, and he was making everyone else pay for his panic. One of the most tactical moves in his search was the use of Atreus's unique gift for languages. When the boy arrived in Asgard, Odin didn't see a grandson to be welcomed. He saw a tool that could finally solve the mystery of the mask. He manipulated the boy with a facade of fatherly validation, giving him the attention and the respect that Kratos was struggling to provide. He set Atreus to work on the translations, hoping that the boy's talent for ancient and foreign tongues would finally unlock the cosmic answers that Odin could not reach on his own. He was using a child to finish a puzzle that had broken the minds of the greatest scholars in history. The search for the mask fragments was a drain on the resources of Asgard that even the Allfather's wealth couldn't fully sustain. He pushed his workers and his mages to the breaking point, demanding that they find new ways to locate the stones. The halls of the Great Lodge were filled with the sound of frantic activity and the smell of desperation. Odin was no longer interested in ruling a kingdom. He was interested in conducting a high-stakes treasure hunt. He was a man who had forgotten the needs of his people because he was too busy trying to save his own skin. He had turned the Aesir into a support staff for his obsession, a transition that left the city vulnerable and its people exhausted. Historical fragments imply that Odin's search for the mask was what eventually drew the attention of the other pantheons. They saw the Allfather's frantic activity and realized that he was reaching for something that could threaten the balance of the entire world. This added a new layer of paranoia to Odin's search, as he began to fear that a foreign variable would step in and steal his prize. He grew even more isolationist, closing the borders of Asgard and turning his surveillance network inward to ensure that no one was leaking information to the outside world. He was a king who had become a prisoner of his own hoard, trapped by the very things he had spent his life collecting. The search across the 9 realms was a journey that led Odin to the brink of insanity. He saw signs and portents in everything, his mind always looking for a connection to the mask. He lost his connection to the living world, trading the warmth of family and the loyalty of friends for the cold promise of a stone. He sat in his lodge and watched through his ravens as the world prepared for war, convinced that if he just found one more piece, none of it would matter. He had searched every realm and found nothing but more questions, and now he was ready to risk everything on a final, desperate gamble. Part 28. Mimir and the Price of Knowing Too Much. Mimir was once Odin's most trusted advisor, the smartest man alive, who provided the Allfather with the wisdom and the perspective he needed to rule a vast and complicated empire. But Mimir saw the rot at the heart of the Allfather's obsession and began to counsel restraint, hoping to pull Odin back from the brink of the madness that was the mask. Odin, however, viewed this interference as a personal betrayal. He didn't want advice. He wanted a witness who would validate his genius and a source who would provide the information he needed without question. When Mimir became an obstacle to his plans, the Allfather's response was a specific and lasting cruelty. Odin imprisoned Mimir in a tree on the peak of Midgard's mountain, a location chosen because it was the highest point in the realm and yet a place of total isolation. He used his magic to bind Mimir to the wood, keeping him alive and conscious so that he could be interrogated whenever the Allfather felt the need. This wasn't just a punishment for a disobedient servant. It was a way to ensure that the smartest man in the world was always available for consultation. Odin would visit the peak to periodically extract information, treating Mimir like a book on a shelf that he could open and close at will. He proved that even his closest friends were just resources in his quest for control. The lore suggests that Odin's cruelty toward Mimir was born from a desire to reclaim the dignity he had lost at the Well of Knowledge. By keeping the man who had tricked him in a state of permanent suffering, Odin felt he could finally balance the scales. He eventually removed one of Mimir's eyes, a Bifrost crystal that allowed the man to see between the realms, and hid it inside a statue of Thor. He did this specifically to prevent Mimir from ever helping others access Jotunheim, ensuring that the only path to the giants was the one Odin controlled. He was a man who would rather blind a friend than lose a tactical advantage. Mimir's life in the tree was a centuries-long torture of the mind and the body. He had to endure the wind, the cold, and the daily visits of the man who had turned him into a living decoration. He watched from his height as the 9 realms fell into decay under Odin's rule, unable to do anything but record the tragedies in his memory. He became a man who remembered everything but could change nothing, a tragic reflection of the wisdom that Odin had rejected. He was the conscience that the Allfather had nailed to a tree, a symbol of the price that everyone in the realms had to pay for Odin's obsession. Odin's relationship with Mimir in those final years was a series of intellectual skirmishes. He would ask questions about the prophecy or the mask, and Mimir would give him the truth, a truth that Odin would then twist and ignore. The Allfather couldn't accept that the smartest man in the world didn't agree with him, so he kept him in the tree to prove that power was more important than wisdom. He wanted to break Mimir's spirit, but the advisor remained defiant even in his imprisonment. Mimir's survival was a quiet victory over the Allfather's spite, a sign that the truth could endure even when it was nailed to a mountain. The price of knowing too much in Odin's world was a life of isolation and pain. The Allfather didn't want equals. He wanted followers, and anyone who showed a glimpse of independence was a target for his wrath. Mimir was the ultimate example of what happens when the Allfather's curiosity turns into a cage. He was a man who had given his life to the service of a king, only to find that the king didn't value his soul. Odin sat in his lodge and thought of the man on the peak, satisfied that he had silenced the one voice that could tell him he was wrong. He had his library, his mask, and his prisoner, and he was ready for the end of the world. Part 29. The spies, the ravens, and the architecture of control. Odin built a surveillance state that wasn't just about watching his enemies, but about owning the very concept of privacy within the 9 realms. He understood early on that if he couldn't be loved by his subjects, he had to be omnipresent in their lives. He created a culture of fear where every shadow felt like a witness and every whisper felt like a confession. This wasn't a system of law, but a system of pure observation. He wanted everyone to feel that the Allfather was standing right behind them, regardless of which realm they were in. This architecture of control was his primary defense against the unpredictable nature of the world, a way to ensure that no plot could ever grow large enough to threaten his seat in Asgard. The primary tools of this network were his 51 spectral ravens, the eyes that he scattered across the 9 realms to watch and report. These birds weren't just animals, but extensions of his own will, bound to him through the magic he'd stolen from the Vanir. They perched on the high peaks of Midgard and the deep mines of Svartalfheim, recording every movement and every conversation. The lore suggests that these ravens were the reason Odin always seemed to be 10 steps ahead of everyone else. He didn't have to guess what people were doing. He simply had to listen to the reports that flew back to the Great Lodge every night. He turned the natural world into a listening post, proving that even the air belonged to the Allfather. This surveillance created a culture of snitching that turned neighbors against each other and families into collections of strangers. People in the 9 realms grew afraid to speak their minds, even in the safety of their own homes. They knew that a single stray word could be carried back to Asgard by a bird or a neighbor looking to gain favor with the crown. Odin encouraged this behavior, rewarding those who brought him useful information and punishing those who kept secrets. He wanted to break the social fabric of the realms so that the only person anyone could trust was him. He was a master of the psychological divide, a king who knew that a fractured people are much easier to rule than a unified one. The cost of maintaining this network was a drain on Odin's own sanity and resources. He spent his days and nights processing a mountain of data, his mind always half-focused on the millions of tiny details his ravens provided. He grew paranoid, searching for patterns in the noise that didn't exist and seeing threats in every innocent gesture. He was a prisoner of his own information, trapped by the sheer volume of the world he was trying to track. The lore suggests that he stopped seeing people as individuals and started seeing them only as sources of risk. He was a god who had forgotten how to live because he was too busy trying to keep the world from moving without his permission. Odin's architecture of control wasn't just about external spies, but internal manipulation. He used his knowledge of everyone's secrets to keep the Aesir in a constant state of performance. No one in Asgard felt entirely safe, not even his own sons. They knew that their father was always watching, always judging, and always looking for a reason to test their loyalty. He created an environment where the only way to survive was to be useful, and the only way to be useful was to follow the Allfather's rules. He was the center of a web that was made of silk and steel, a web that caught everyone who tried to fly too close to the sun. He sat in his lodge, surrounded by his birds, and waited for the world to make a mistake. The presence of the ravens across the realms was a constant reminder of the Allfather's suffocating grip. When Kratos and Atreus began their journey, they found these green, spectral birds watching them from the ruins of the old world. Every raven they killed was a small act of rebellion, a way to blind the god who thought he owned their story. Odin watched these deaths with a clinical interest, realizing that a new variable had entered his system. He didn't panic, he simply adjusted his surveillance, focusing his network on the Spartan and his son. He was a man who believed that if he watched something long enough, he would eventually find the secret to breaking it. His architecture was holding, but for the first time in centuries, the walls were starting to vibrate. Odin's choice to impersonate Tyr was his most pragmatic act of evil, a move that allowed him to sit in the very heart of his enemy's home. He knew that Kratos and Atreus would never trust the Allfather, but he also knew they would die for the memory of the god of war. By posing as Tyr, he gained access to their plans, their fears, and their most private conversations. He lived in a broom closet in Sindri's house, eating scraps and acting like a broken, hollowed-out man who had lost his will to fight. It was the ultimate internal leak, a performance that required him to hide his massive ego behind a facade of pacifism and trauma. He wasn't just spying on them, he was steering them away from the very war he was terrified of losing. The lore suggests that Odin spent years preparing for this specific role, studying his son's mannerisms and his philosophical outlook to ensure the disguise was flawless. He spoke in soft, measured tones and advocated for peace at every turn, making the heroes believe that the legendary Tyr was too damaged to lead an army. This was a brilliant tactical move, as it effectively neutralized the one person the Nine Realms would have followed into battle against Asgard. Odin used the name of his own son to protect his throne, turning Tyr's reputation into a shield for the man who had imprisoned him. He was a master of the long game, a king who was willing to live like a beggar if it meant he could keep the world in the dark. Watching the group from the inside gave Odin a level of intelligence that his ravens could never provide. He saw the bond between Kratos and Atreus and looked for the cracks he could use to pull them apart. He heard their discussions about the prophecy and the mask, adjusting his own moves in Asgard to match their progress. He was a ghost in the machine, a variable that they didn't know they had to account for. Every time they thought they were making a secret move, Odin was there, nodding his head and offering a word of caution that was actually a directive. He was a man who had turned his enemy's safe haven into his own private observation deck. The emotional toll on the heroes when the truth was revealed was a disaster they never truly recovered from. Brok was the first to see through the mask, his sharp mind noticing the inconsistencies in the Allfather's performance. When Odin realized he'd been caught, he didn't hesitate to kill the dwarf, shedding the disguise with a cold violence that shocked everyone in the room. He had spent months living with these people, sharing their food and their home, and he didn't feel a single spark of remorse for the betrayal. He was a god who saw other people as objects to be used, and the disguise was just another tool that had reached its expiration date. He left a trail of blood in a house that had once been a place of peace. Impersonating Tyr allowed Odin to understand Atreus in a way that would have been impossible from a throne in Asgard. He saw the boy's hunger for knowledge and his desperation for a purpose, and he used his time as Tyr to plant the seeds of curiosity that would eventually lead the boy to his lodge. He wasn't just watching a child, he was grooming a successor. He tailored his words to appeal to Atreus's unique sense of justice and his gift for languages, making the Allfather's path look like the only moral choice left. He was a master of the slow manipulation, a man who could turn a son against a father without ever raising his voice. He had played the part of the broken god to perfection, and the realms paid the price for their trust. This period of the story highlights the depth of Odin's commitment to his own survival. He was the king of the Aesir, the master of the Nine Realms, yet he was willing to sleep on a floor and pretend to be a victim for weeks. He didn't care about the dignity of his position, only the results of his operation. He saw the world as a game of information, and he was the only player who was willing to burn the board to win. By becoming Tyr, he proved that there was no identity he wouldn't steal, and no bond he wouldn't break to stay one step ahead of the end. He was the Allfather of a world of lies, and he was finally ready to show his true face to the people he had betrayed. Part 31. Watching Kratos arrive in Midgard, Odin had been aware of Kratos for years before the Spartan ever stepped out of the shadows of his forest. He knew the history of the ghost of Sparta and what he had done to the Greek pantheon, viewing him as a dangerous foreign variable that could disrupt the delicate balance of the Nine Realms. The lore suggests that Odin feared Kratos as a chaos agent, a man whose very existence was a challenge to the idea of a fixed prophecy. He didn't try to kill the Spartan immediately, as he realized that a fight with a god-killer was a coin flip he didn't want to take. Instead, he watched from a distance, using his ravens to map Kratos' movements and understand his motivations. He was a king who was trying to decide if he should treat the stranger as a threat or a potential asset. The deaths of Magni, Modi, and eventually Baldur were the moments that forced Odin's hand. He saw that his sons were failing to contain the Spartan, and that the cycle of violence was escalating in a way he couldn't control. The death of Baldur, in particular, was a catastrophe that triggered the beginning of Fimbulwinter, a fixed point in the prophecy that Odin had spent centuries trying to avoid. He realized that Kratos wasn't just a traveler, but the spark that was going to light the fire of Ragnarök. This moved the Allfather from a state of observation to a state of active intervention. He could no longer afford to wait and see what the Spartan would do. He had to find a way to remove him from the board. Odin's approach to Kratos was marked by a cautious, intellectual curiosity. He wanted to know how a man could kill an entire pantheon and still seek a life of peace. He looked at Kratos and saw a reflection of the violence he had used to build his own empire, but with a sense of regret that the Allfather found baffling. He tried to negotiate with Kratos, offering him a deal that would keep the Spartan out of the affairs of the Aesir. He presented himself as a reasonable man who just wanted to keep his world safe, hoping to appeal to Kratos' desire to protect his son. He was a master of the verbal probe, testing the Spartan's patience and his resolve with every word he spoke. The arrival of a foreign god in Midgard was a challenge to Odin's isolationist policies that he couldn't easily solve. He had spent so long closing the doors of the 9 realms that he was unprepared for someone who simply kicked them down. He saw Kratos as a virus that was infecting his system, a being that didn't follow the rules of the Norse world. This made the Allfather incredibly nervous, as his surveillance network wasn't designed to track a man who didn't exist in the local records. He had to build a new profile for Kratos on the fly, trying to predict the moves of a man who was driven by a father's love rather than a god's ego. It was a tactical nightmare for a man who lived for order. The lore suggests that Odin's plan for Kratos was to eventually steer him toward a path of irrelevance. He hoped that by offering the Spartan a quiet life, he could neutralize the threat without having to risk a direct confrontation. He didn't want a war with the ghost of Sparta. He wanted Kratos to simply go away. When that failed, he turned his attention to Atreus, realizing that the son was the key to the father's cooperation. He began to look for ways to pull the boy away from Kratos, believing that if he held the son, he could control the father. He was a man who saw every relationship as a leverage point, and he was ready to pull the trigger. Odin's initial interactions with Kratos were a series of calculated risks. He visited the Spartan's home and spoke to him in his own garden, a display of confidence that was actually a mask for his deep-seated fear. He wanted Kratos to believe that the Allfather wasn't afraid of him, even as his ravens were reporting the scale of the Spartan's power. He was playing a high-stakes game of bluff, trying to win a peace that would allow him to focus on the mask. He looked at the man who had destroyed Olympus and saw the beginning of the end for Asgard. He was a king who was trying to hold back the tide with a conversation, and he was starting to realize that the water was much deeper than he'd thought. Part 32. The introduction and what was really happening. The first time Odin introduced himself to Kratos and Atreus in God of War Ragnarök, it wasn't a meeting of 2 kings, but a performance of a man who wanted to appear harmless. He didn't arrive with an army or a display of divine power. He arrived with a request for a conversation. He sat in their home and offered a path to peace, suggesting that the blood of the past didn't have to define the future. Beneath the surface of this offer, he was probing for their weaknesses and testing the dynamics of their relationship. He was looking for the button he could push to make them stop their journey. He was selling the idea of Asgard as a place of safety and order, a safe haven that was better than the cold reality of Fimbulwinter. Every word Odin spoke was a calculation designed to lure Atreus away from his father. He recognized the boy's curiosity and his need for validation, and he tailored his sales pitch to meet those desires. He spoke of the mask and the rift as a grand adventure that only someone with Atreus's gift could complete. He wasn't just offering a job. He was offering a destiny. He wanted the boy to feel that staying with Kratos was a limitation, while coming to Asgard was a liberation. He was a master of the psychological pull, making the villain's lodge look like a scholar's library. He was a god who knew that the best way to catch a bird is to build a cage that looks like a nest. Kratos saw through the charm, but the lore suggests that Odin wasn't talking to the father. He was talking to the son. Knowing that Atreus's youthful idealism would be easier to manipulate than Kratos' hard-won skepticism, he used the memory of the war and the threat of Ragnarök to frame his request as a moral necessity. He told them that he was the only one who could stop the end of the world, making his own survival look like a selfless act of service. He was a man who had spent a lifetime lying to his own people, and he was practicing his craft on a new audience with a terrifying level of skill. He wasn't there to find peace. He was there to recruit a specialist. While he was talking, Odin's ravens were busy mapping the house and the surrounding area, gathering data that would be used for future interventions. He was checking the structural integrity of their safe haven and the mood of their companions. He was a general conducting a reconnaissance mission under the guise of a diplomatic visit. He wanted to know exactly who was in the room and what they were willing to do to protect each other. He was a king who never did anything for a single reason, and the introduction was a multi-layered operation that was designed to give him a permanent foothold in their lives. He left their home with a smile and a promise, but he also left with the information he needed to start tearing them apart. The lore suggests that Odin's offer of peace was a lie, that he had told so many times he had started to believe it himself. He saw himself as a man of reason who was being forced into violence by the stubbornness of others. He looked at Kratos and saw an obstacle to progress, a man who would rather fight a war than solve a puzzle. He viewed his own manipulation of Atreus as a kind of mentorship, a way to save the boy from the narrow-mindedness of a Spartan general. He was a man who had completely lost touch with the moral weight of his actions, seeing the world as a game where the only rule was that the Allfather must win. He was a god who had replaced his heart with a strategy. The introduction set the stage for the psychological war that would define the rest of the campaign. Odin had established himself as a player in their story, someone who couldn't be ignored or easily dismissed. He had planted the seeds of doubt in Atreus's mind and the seeds of anger in Kratos' heart. He was a man who knew how to start a fire with a single word, and he was ready to watch the flames grow. He walked away from their house and returned to Asgard, satisfied that he had successfully opened the door. He was the Allfather, and he was finally ready to play the final hand of a game he had been playing for centuries. Part 33. Atreus as Loki and Odin's plan for him. Odin viewed Atreus not as a grandson to be loved, but as a successor of thought, a being who possessed the unique talents he needed to complete his life's work. He saw the boy's ability to read ancient languages and his natural connection to the realms as the final pieces of the puzzle that was the mask. When Atreus arrived in Asgard, Odin didn't put him in a cell. He gave him a library and a purpose. He offered the boy the kind of fatherly validation that Kratos, in his stoic Spartan way, was struggling to provide. He made Atreus feel like an equal, a partner in a grand quest for the truth of the universe. He was a master of the grooming process, turning the son of a giant into the architect of his own people's end. The plan for Atreus was to use him as a living key to the rift. Odin believed that only a being with the blood of a giant and the mind of a scholar could put on the mask and look into the void without being destroyed. He spent his days in Asgard, encouraging Atreus's curiosity and praising his progress, all while hiding the fact that he was preparing the boy for a sacrifice. He wanted to use the boy's talent to gain the cosmic answers that had eluded the Allfather for centuries, effectively turning Loki into a tool for his own survival. He was a man who saw no problem in using a child to solve a problem that had broken the minds of gods. Odin's manipulation of Atreus was built on a series of carefully crafted half-truths. He told the boy about the importance of the mask and the danger of the prophecy, making himself look like a weary scholar who just wanted to understand the world. He played on Atreus's sense of justice, suggesting that the only way to save the 9 realms was to look into the rift and find a new way forward. He made the boy feel that his destiny was tied to Asgard and that his father's path was a dead end. He was a master of the psychological divide, a king who knew that the best way to win a heart is to give it a reason to feel special. The lore suggests that Odin's interest in Atreus was also a way to secure the future of the Aesir. He saw the boy as a potential new Allfather, someone who could carry on his legacy of order and control after he was gone. He wanted to mold Loki in his own image, just stripping away the Spartan influence of Kratos and the Vanir influence of Frey. He was a man who was trying to build a dynasty of thought, a world where the search for the truth was the only thing that mattered. He didn't care about the boy's humanity, only his potential to serve the machine. He was a god who had replaced the love of a father with the cold expectations of a mentor. As Atreus grew closer to the secret of the mask, Odin's mask of the mentor began to slip. He grew impatient with the boy's hesitation and his lingering loyalty to his father. He started to show the flashes of anger and the need for absolute control that had defined his rule for centuries. He realized that even his most careful manipulation couldn't completely erase the bond between Kratos and his son. This made the Allfather nervous, as he saw his final chance at survival slipping through his fingers. He began to push the boy harder, demanding results and threatening consequences if the mask wasn't completed. He was a man who was running out of time, and he was ready to break the boy to get what he wanted. Ultimately, Atreus, as Loki, was the one variable that Odin's surveillance state couldn't fully account for. The boy's choices were driven by a sense of morality and a connection to his family that the Allfather had long since discarded. When the time came to look into the rift, Atreus chose his father over the truth, a decision that effectively ended Odin's world. The Allfather had spent years trying to turn a son against his father, only to find that love was a stronger force than curiosity. He was a king who had lost his final gamble, a god who had used every tool in his library and still come up empty. He was left with a broken mask and a future that was finally, terrifyingly clear. Part 34. The final battle and the Soul Stone. The final battle in the ruins of Asgard was the moment the Allfather's wall of secrets finally came crashing down. Odin fought like a cornered animal, using every scrap of magic and every trick he had gathered over the centuries to stay alive. He wasn't fighting for a principle or a people. He was fighting for his own existence. He moved through the battlefield with a desperate, frantic energy, his one eye searching for a way to escape the fate he had spent his life trying to avoid. But he was facing the combined might of Kratos, Freya, and Atreus, a trio that represented the very things he had tried to destroy: the strength of a soldier, the spirit of the Vanir, and the foresight of the giants. When the mask was finally broken and the rift was closed, Odin's world ended. He had lost the one thing that gave his life a purpose and his rule a direction. He stood in the wreckage of his city and looked at the people he had spent centuries trying to control. He saw their anger, their grief, and their exhaustion, and for the first time, he had no lies left to tell them. He was a king without a kingdom, a god without a future. The lore suggests that his final moments were a pathetic display of a man who still couldn't accept his own defeat. He was a tyrant who was trying to bargain with a tide that was already sweeping him away. Just the decision to trap Odin's soul in a giant's marble was the only way to deactivate the Allfather without creating a new cycle of violence. Atreus used the magic of his people to capture the essence of the god, turning the most powerful being in the realms into a small, cold object. It was a moment of pure justice, a being of infinite ego reduced to a pocket-sized secret. For a few seconds, it appeared that the realms might find a way to offer the Allfather a trial, or a period of reflection. But the lore suggests that a man like Odin doesn't deserve a trial. He deserves to be erased so that the world can finally breathe again. Sindri's choice to smash the stone was the only final word that the realms could accept. The dwarf had lost his brother and his home to the Allfather's games, and he wasn't interested in a diplomatic solution. He took the marble and crushed it with a single, focused act of revenge, permanently ending the existence of the man who had caused so much suffering. It was a quiet, brutal finish for a god who had wanted a cosmic destiny. Odin didn't go out in a blaze of glory or a grand explosion. He was simply snuffed out like a candle in a cold room. He was gone, and the weight of his rule was lifted from the shoulders of the world. The death of the Allfather was a release for everyone who had been caught in his web. The ravens stopped watching, the walls of Asgard fell, and the 9 realms were finally free to write their own stories. But the damage he had caused was deep and lasting. He had spent centuries breaking people and destroying cultures, and his absence left a hole that wouldn't be easily filled. He was a man who had built a world that was designed to die with him, and his final act was to ensure that the end would be as painful as possible. He was the architect of a catastrophe, and his legacy was a pile of ruins and a collection of broken hearts. Odin's story is a warning about the cost of an obsession with the future and the corruption of divine power. He was a god who had started with the gift of breath and ended with a hand around the throat of the universe. He had traded everything that made life worth living for a glimpse of a truth that couldn't save him. He was a king who had forgotten that a father's job is to prepare his children for the world, not to prepare the world for his children. He sat in his lodge and waited for the end, and when it finally came, it was brought by the very people he had tried to erase. He was the Allfather of a dying age, and his time was finally, permanently up. Odin left behind 9 realms that were free but deeply scarred by his centuries of totalitarian rule. He had built a world that was entirely dependent on his guidance and his surveillance, and his sudden absence created a massive power vacuum that threatened to pull everything back into chaos. The realms were like a body that had been living on a life support machine for too long, now forced to remember how to breathe on its own. The lore suggests that the aftermath of the Allfather's death was a period of intense struggle and slow rebuilding, as the survivors had to unlearn the lessons of fear and suspicion that Odin had taught them. It was a world that was finally awake, but it was waking up in a room full of ghosts. To manage the transition, a council of realms was formed to rule instead of a single Allfather. This was a move toward the multicultural alliance that Tyr had always dreamed of, a way to ensure that no single god could ever seize absolute power again. Representatives from every realm sat at the table, trying to find a way to share the resources and the wisdom of the world. But the infrastructure of control that Odin had built was deep and difficult to dismantle. The ravens might have been gone, but the habits of snitching and the fear of the dark remained in the hearts of the people. It was a peace built on exhaustion, a temporary pause as the realms tried to figure out what they wanted to become. The physical state of the realms was a disaster that would take generations to fix. Asgard was gone, leaving the Aesir who survived as refugees in a world that had spent centuries hating them. Midgard was a ruin of Fimbulwinter, the forests and the lakes struggling to recover from the magical cold. Vanaheim was still recovering from the war and the corruption of the Allfather's influence, and Svartalfheim was left to deal with the legacy of Odin's economic exploitation. The lore suggests that the realms were culturally and spiritually stunted, the vibrant traditions of the past replaced by the cold efficiency of the Aesir system. It was a world that had been hollowed out to feed one man's ego. The question the games leave open is whether the prophecy of Ragnarök was ever something that could have been stopped, till Odin had spent his life trying to rewrite the future. But his very efforts were what ensured that the end would be a catastrophe. He had created the resentments, the weapons, and the alliances that led to his own downfall. He proved that fate isn't a fixed line, but a series of choices, and his choices were always driven by fear rather than wisdom. He had tried to be the author of the universe, but he was just another character who couldn't see the edges of the page. He was a man who had been defeated by the very truth he had tried to steal. Rebuilding from the Allfather's rule required a process of unlearning that was painful for everyone involved. The gods and the mortals of the 9 realms had to find a new way to interact, one that wasn't built on leverage and secrets. They had to learn how to trust each other again, a task that felt impossible after 300 years of surveillance. Freya, Tyr, and Kratos became the reluctant leaders of this new world, trying to offer a path of healing and justice to a people who had forgotten what those things felt like. They were the ones who had to clean up the mess the Allfather had left behind, a job that was more difficult than any battle they had ever fought. Ultimately, the 9 realms, after Odin, were a place of hope and immense difficulty. The suffocating grip of the Allfather was gone, but the world was still waiting for a new light to guide it. The story of Odin is a tragedy of a god who wanted to be everything and ended up being nothing. He left a legacy of ruins and a collection of broken systems, but he also left a world that was finally free to make its own mistakes. The future was no longer a secret to be hoarded, but a journey to be lived, and for the first time in history, the people of the 9 realms were the ones who held the pen. The Allfather was dead, and the age of the individual had finally begun.